Point of order, Mr. Kevin-Brennan.
On a point of order, I understand that the Prime Minister has announced that there is to be a judge-led public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. Wouldn't it have been better, Mr. Speaker, if that announcement had been made just once, for once, in this House to honourable members?
The short answer is it is better if key announcements of policy or other government intent are communicated first to the House when the House is in session. I'm not aware, because I've been attending to my duties in the chair, of that announcement. If that is so, it may very well be that it will be warmly welcomed, and I don't cavil at that, but the honourable gentleman asked me a very specific question, to which I have given him a specific answer. Yesterday, when the honourable lady, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, sought leave to secure an emergency debate on a specific and important matter, namely her sense of the need for a full public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal, there had obviously been no such announcement. I judged that it was indeed a proper matter to be debated under the terms of Standing Order 24, and notwithstanding any announcement outside of the House, an indication of parliamentary opinion on the subject remains, in my view, extremely germane and arguably just as urgent. I agreed yesterday, but more particularly the House gave its approval to the honourable lady to pursue this matter, and I felt, and I still feel, that it warranted and it warrants up to 3 hours of debate today. So I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, but it certainly didn't in any way dissuade us from a proper and comprehensive focus on this matter now. So we proceed to the emergency debate, and I call first Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I beg to move that this House has considered the need for an independent public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. Can I just first of all start by thanking you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing this emergency debate. This is the first time that there's been an emergency debate on the contaminated blood scandal, and it arises, as you know, after further evidence of criminal actions produced by the Right Honourable Andy Burnham and a joint letter calling for a Hillsborough-style inquiry from all 6 non-government Westminster leaders. Now, after the announcement from Downing Street this lunchtime, it may become an even more popular route to get the government to listen and act in the future. In light of that government announcement that there is to be a full inquiry into this scandal, I want to start by acknowledging all of those people who've been involved in getting us to this point. And I want to start with my own constituent, Glenn Wilkinson, for his persistence and dogged determination when he came to see me in 2010 to tell me his story. I think he's really been the person who I've always kept at the centre of whatever I've attempted to do on this issue. I also want to thank the many, many individuals and campaign groups who fought for years to get to this point. Manor House, Contaminated Blood Campaign, Tainted Blood. I want to thank the Haemophilia Society, and particularly its Chief Executive Liz Carroll, and Jefferson Courtney, the Policy and Public Affairs Officer. There are over 2,400 individuals who tragically lost their lives. They are not here to see this announcement, but their voice lives on through their family members who have never given up fighting for them. I also want to say something about journalists, because I think this campaign that's run for many years has, at times, we've had the great benefit of brilliant investigative journalists, including Caroline Wheeler of the Sunday Times, who was formerly a correspondent on the Hull Daily Mail. We had the many researchers and journalists who did the BBC Panorama documentary into the disaster just a few months ago, and the Daily Mail, which I know is not a favourite of yours, Mr. Speaker, but they did run a very good story on the front of their paper last week. I also want to say something. I will in 1 minute. I just want to continue with this point around thanking people. I want to particularly thank the 111 parliamentarians who are members of the APPG group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. I want to particularly thank my co-chair, the Honourable Member for Worthing West, the previous chair, Jason McCartney, who's no longer a member of this House, Margaret Ritchie and Mark Durkin, who are no longer members of this House but were very vocal in the campaign for this. And of course I have to say a really big thank you to the Right Honourable Andy Burnham, who I think in that valedictory speech that he made before he left Parliament set out very clearly why this was unfinished business and we needed to have a public inquiry. And finally I want to thank the late Right Honourable Paul Goggins, who again was a huge inspiration in this cause. Yes, I want to help.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is completely right to thank all of those people, but there is, of course, one person missing from that list, and that is herself. And I think the whole House should thank the honourable lady for the tireless work she's done over the last 7 years on this. An absolutely brilliant campaign. And I've got to say this. This shows how Parliament really should work. Her constituents raised an issue with her. She's campaigned on it non-stop. She's not been fobbed off. She's pursued it doggedly. And she's brought us, I think, she's played a huge role in bringing us to this point today. And I just want to say one other thing, if I can. Last night, I had a load of emails from constituents who've been affected by this scandal. And I want to tell her how grateful they are to her for the work that she's done on this.
Well said.
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for those comments, but I think it was a combined effort of so many people over so many years. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I would too pay my own tribute to my honourable friend. She has been absolutely dogged in her determination and not giving up. And I too had in mind my constituent David Thomas, who came to see me in a very similar circumstance. If he hadn't have come to see me, as I know many other constituents have done in going to see their members on all sides of the House, I would have not even been aware of this scandal, let alone have shown the need to deal with it so fully. Will she also join me in paying tribute to national and regional groups like Haemophilia Wales, who have done so much to stand up for those affected in particular locations like Wales, and also to throw up some of the difficulties as well, in that this was a legacy issue from the UK Department of Health, and the complications now of devolved health services across the UK, throwing up some of those questions which we will need to address in the terms of this inquiry.
Yes, I think my honourable friend makes that point very well. I want to use the opportunity today to make a few comments about the way we handle disasters and to say something about how I think the best way forward in terms of a Hillsborough-style inquiry should be established by the government. Yes, I will give way.
I'm very grateful, and I add my congratulations to the Honourable Lady for her brilliant leadership on this. But does she agree with me that whilst this is incredibly welcome news, there is also an urgency, because those people who continue to suffer need help now, and there's a danger that this process could go on for years and leave them still waiting for some support?
I think the Right Honourable Gentleman makes a very important point, and I think the timetabling of any such inquiry that's going to happen needs to be set out very clearly, and I hope the Minister might be able to help us with that in his contribution.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that point, and I too would want to add my congratulations to her and Andy Burnham, because this has been going on for a very long time. Have you had any indication from 10 Downing Street what form this inquiry is actually going to take? Because some of my constituents have got similar problems to her constituents with this. Can't you give us any clarification on that?
Johnson. Well, I've only seen, like every other member of the House, what's on the what's out in the media, which is that there's going to be a consultation, I understand, on what form the inquiry will take. But I'm sure the Minister will be able to help us in his contribution later on. I will finally, then I'm going to move on.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'd like to join the tributes to her and the all-party group of which I've been a member, because I think it is an example of how Parliament can work well. There's a family in Letchworth who've said to me that as a family we've suffered years of misery because of this scandal. And does she agree with me that it is right to consult the victims and their families about the form of the inquiry?
Absolutely, the Honourable Gentleman makes a good point there as well, and I will come on to that in what I want to say. But I just want to make some general comments. I don't really need to remind the House of the damage that public disasters cause to all those affected. We know from the Hillsborough tragedy in 1989, and more recently, of course, the appalling fire at Grenfell Tower. Every public disaster of this kind is different. Their causes are different, the victims suffer in different ways, and the measures necessary to support those affected and their families differ also. But there is one thing which I feel every victim has a fundamental right to, and that is the right to answers. They deserve to be told what went wrong, why it went wrong, and who is responsible for what happened. The story of the injustice they have suffered also needs to be set out and told to the wider public. Their voices need to be heard. Apologies, compensation, and other forms of support are essential. But if their right to answers is not also satisfied, I feel that they will be denied true and meaningful justice.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will once
Thank
time.
her. She's making a very powerful case, and thank her for all the work she's done. As she said at the beginning, many, many victims have died. And it is now their families that are still here, but they are still grieving, and they need answers as much as the victims.
That's right. My honourable friend is absolutely right on that. I just want to go back to the fact that this tragedy, as my honourable friend has just said, has taken the lives of over 2,400 people with haemophilia, infected mainly from blood factor concentrates. Many others without bleeding disorders who've been infected through blood transfusions and other means have also lost their lives. Thousands more have been left devastated. The survivors left to live with a combination of HIV, hepatitis C and a range of other viruses. My constituent, who I referred to, Glenn Wilkinson, is one such individual. He has haemophilia and was infected with hepatitis C when he was just 19 during a routine tooth operation. Glenn is one of thousands of people who have fallen victim to the worst treatment disaster in the history of our NHS and one of the worst peacetime disasters that has ever taken place in this country. And indeed, when I was looking through the 15 or so non-terrorist related public disasters, ranging from the Bradford City Stadium fire in 1985 to the Clapham Junction crash in 1988, to the Marchioness disaster, and of course Hillsborough, each of these were tragic events, and I don't wish to detract from the magnitude of those events, but the House should note that in all of the ones that I was looking at, all of those disasters led to a public inquiry, and honourable members and their affected constituents are entitled to ask, why has the same not happened with contaminated blood? Had more than 2,400 people died over the course of one day or 1 year, it would have been inconceivable for any government to refuse calls for a public inquiry. Yet the devastation caused by the contaminated blood scandal has been spread not over days or years, but over several decades. We must also bear in mind the profound effect that this scandal has had on one community, those with bleeding disorders, many of whom were provided with contaminated blood factor concentrates sourced from profit-making American firms. Virtually everyone who had haemophilia at the time has been infected. Honourable members will appreciate that when friends and close-knit communities are hit by a collective tragedy, its impact can be devastating. Consider, for example, the Tree Law School for Disabled Children, a special school with a large number of pupils with haemophilia. 72 of its pupils have died because of this scandal. Many were forced to be silent to the suffering, either for fear of the stigma of having HIV or hepatitis C or other viruses, or because they weren't even aware that they had these conditions. But as important as this distinction is, it does not excuse the fact that successive governments of all colours have sidestepped this issue for too long. Internationally, we know in France, investigations saw the imprisonment of the former head of their blood transfusion service and his deputy, and a former health minister was found guilty of manslaughter. In Japan, 3 executives of companies were imprisoned and an official was convicted on negligence charges. And in the United States, the private companies involved in this tragedy paid out millions in out-of-court settlements across the world. But nothing of this kind has happened in the UK. I'll just finish this point. In 1991, in response to the threat of court cases, the government set up an ex gratia payment scheme. There was no implication of liability, no use of the word compensation, and waivers renouncing the individual's right to take further legal action had to be signed before they could obtain small sums of money. I'm happy to give way.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. My constituent, who does not wish to be named, wants us to include the remit of the Skipton Fund in this particular review because she feels, and many others do, the remit was wrongly drawn up and that she and others have been denied the justice they should have had.
Yes, the Honourable Lady makes a very important point, and I'm going to mention that. I will, yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I also congratulate her on the work she's done on this issue. And I welcome the fact that there is going to be a public inquiry eventually and at last. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this public inquiry should address the issues of why the UK was the last country in the Western world to introduce a test for hepatitis C? Why vital documents were destroyed by the Department of Health? And why the UK took 13 years to get self-sufficiency in blood products when it took Ireland only 5 years?
Yes, again, very important questions for any inquiry to deal with. I just want to turn now to today's announcement and the joint Westminster Leaders letter of the 7th of July, which I think provided a blueprint for how such an inquiry should be conducted. First of all, as with Hillsborough, there should be a commitment to secure full public disclosure of details related to this tragedy through a process managed by the affected community. There should be a mechanism to ensure all public bodies involved in the scandal are compelled to give oral and written evidence to it. Assurances need to be given that it will cover the role of American firms in providing blood factor concentrate to people with haemophilia. An investigation also, not just about the run-up to the scandal, but its actual aftermath. And finally, it has to look at these allegations of criminal conduct. And I hope, as I said a little earlier on, the Minister will also be able to help us with a timetable for this inquiry, as those affected have waited so long to actually get to this point.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I do pay tribute to her chairpersonship of the All-Party Parliamentary Group. And I know that my constituent Cathy Young is very grateful to her and other MPs, because they would have given up if it was not for members of Parliament pursuing this issue. On health records, my constituent Cathy Young has now got access to her husband's health records, and she describes them as a fairy tale. Does she agree with me that those affected through this scandal, if they have not already done so, should get their family health records and have a look at them?
Yes, I think the honourable gentleman makes a very important point, and I certainly agree with that. Yes, I'll give way, and then I'm going to make some progress.
Thank you. And again, I pay tribute to the member for Hull North for the absolutely outstanding leadership she has shown on this very important issue. My constituent, Alex Smith, has been affected by this. There's a great deal been said about the contaminated blood, the response from government, the potential criminal cover-up that's taken place, but also the absolutely immoral way that victims have been treated with the financial payments they get, many living in absolute destitution and poverty as a result of the government penny pinching, when actually that should form part of the review.
Yes, I think my honourable friend's correct that we need to look very carefully at the support that's been provided in the past and what actually should be provided in the future for this group. I'll give way, yes, I will two more times.
I'm very grateful for giving way, and I'd like to add my thanks on behalf of my constituent Hayden Lewis and his family, his brother who died, Hayden who died, and other members of the family who've been impacted. But the point I wanted to make, would she agree with me that we should learn from the lessons of the thalidomide inquiry and compensation fund in this inquiry to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes that were made with thalidomide?
Yes, I think that again is an excellent point that needs to be considered. I'll give way one last time.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'd like to pay tribute to her on behalf of my constituents, Jane Jones, whose family have endured with great privation because of the scandal for many, many years. In a written answer in the Welsh Assembly on the 27th of March, there is confirmation, of course, that the payments continue to be made on an ex gratia basis, that no liability is accepted. And again, the answer actually is in Welsh, but it confirms that the payment of £10,000 to a partner or a widow continues again on this ex gratia basis.
I think that goes to the heart of it, really, that there's never been any finding of liability, and that then has resulted in very low payments being made on a kind of support basis rather than a compensatory basis. I just want to reiterate, before I move on to the 4 questions that I think the panel or the inquiry needs to look at, that I strongly believe, and I think the majority of the APPG believe, that a Hillsborough-style inquiry is the best way forward in this case. Putting those affected at the heart of whatever is created and set up. So, for instance, giving people the opportunity to have an input into the terms of reference, being able to look at people who might be considered to be the chairperson of the inquiry or any panel members of the inquiry. This has to actually have the support and confidence of all those affected. And that's why, looking at what happened with the Hillsborough-style inquiry, with the Hillsborough inquiry, that seemed to work effectively. So in Hillsborough, it was known as Families First. And I hope that that might be able to carry on with this inquiry as it's set up. So I also think that all those affected need to be treated with the utmost respect and reverence and fully consulted. And any information that becomes available should first of all go to those people affected. I want to just, in the remaining few minutes, talk about the 4 questions that I have around that I think that the inquiry needs to look at. In Andy Burnham's speech, that when he set out the case for why there needed to be an inquiry, and of course he was one of 2 former health secretaries, the other being the Right Honourable the Lord Owen, who had raised serious concerns about the scandal. And we know then there was the Panorama programme and then recently the Daily Mail article. From what Andy Burnham said and from all the developments in the last few months, there are serious questions which I still believe need to be addressed by a public inquiry. So, first of all, why did the government not act sooner to protect the blood supplies once the risks became known? And why were we so reliant on American commercial products for haemophilia patients? Because the UK was not self-sufficient in blood supplies, profit-making American companies played a considerable role in supplying factor concentrates to haemophilia patients. This blood was sourced from much riskier patients, including prison inmates who were much more likely to have infections and had a financial incentive to be less than honest about their risks of infection. The dangers of American products were being discussed in public, not from the 1990s nor the 1980s, but from 1970. As the Daily Mail reported last week, files now suggested that at least as early as 1980, officials had even put an estimate on the number of haemophilia patients being infected from these products, with what we now know to be hepatitis C. They put the figure at 50 a year, yet it was not until 1986 that they took any action to address this. If the whole of the UK had been self-sufficient in blood supplies, fewer haemophilia patients would have been infected. We know this because Scotland had higher levels of self-sufficiency than England. And as the BBC Panorama programme outlined, this meant that haemophiliacs in England were twice as likely to be infected with HIV as those in Scotland. And even in the mid-1980s, when the danger of hepatitis C and HIV became known, it appears we could have acted sooner to remove risky blood products. And when the United States started screening their commercial products from March 1983, we carried on using non-screened American supplies that we had purchased before March. How can that possibly be justified? So my second question for the inquiry: why were patients kept in the dark and not told of the risks once they became known? There are many aspects to this controversy which I know other honourable members may wish to touch on, but I want to draw the House's attention to developments in 1983 at the midst of the AIDS epidemic, when there was still uncertainty about whether AIDS was a blood-borne disease. In November 1983, the then Health Minister, and still the Right Honourable Member for Rushcliffe, told Parliament that there was no conclusive evidence that AIDS is transmitted by blood products. Yet earlier this same year, his department was preparing internal documents which said the opposite. In August 1983, the same department, the Department of Health, was telling practising homosexuals and drug users not to give blood because of the risk of transmitting AIDS. In the summer of '83, the department was preparing a blood donor leaflet which said AIDS was almost certainly transmitted by blood and blood products. And again in July 1983, the UK Haemophilia Centre Doctors Organisation said that young children with haemophilia should receive a less risky form of blood product due to the dangers of AIDS. And between March and May 1983, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service prepared a leaflet for blood donors. It included haemophiliacs and recipients of blood transfusion on a list of people who could get AIDS, and asked these same individuals not to give blood. And of course the Penrose Inquiry, the Scottish Penrose Inquiry, acknowledged that in adopting its position in November 1983, the then government relied heavily on a highly nuanced use of language. My third point is, why were some people tested for viruses without their knowledge and only told of the results many years later? Yeah. There are many cases of this happening, and I'll just make reference to one, Jonathan Evans, who was first tested positive for HIV in 1984, yet he wasn't told of this until 7 months later in the mid-1985 period. This posed a huge health risk to his wider family, and the history of this scandal is full of cases of spouses infecting each other. Yeah. Tragically, the virus took his life, and his son Jason was just 4 years old when his father died. He is still campaigning for justice for his father, and he's been instrumental in generating recent news coverage in the Daily Mail article and elsewhere. Fourthly, there are allegations of a criminal cover-up on an industrial scale from the highest ranks of government downwards. At every stage of this scandal, there are concerns that officials knew more than they were letting on. Almost everyone affected by the scandal has encountered issues with lost medical records. Others have recovered their files only to find any mention of the connection with contaminated blood being removed. Some individuals today are unable to access financial support via the Skipton Fund because of what has happened to their medical records. These cases of lost records also extend to the highest level of government. During the Archer inquiry, Lord Owen requested his departmental papers from the time he was a health minister in the 1970s. He was told they'd been destroyed under the 10-year rule, even though there's no evidence of such a rule existing. And finally, when people were forced to sign waivers in 1991, as I mentioned earlier in my speech, they were asked to commit to no further legal action for hepatitis C litigation as well as HIV. These individuals did not yet know they had hepatitis C, as the disease had a long incubation period. The inescapable conclusion seems to be that departmental officials knew more than they were willing to disclose. Now, in conclusion, earlier this week, the Prime Minister indicated her intention to work more with other party leaders to act in the best interests of the country. And she has shown a laudable commitment to this with respect for other public disasters, including the child abuse inquiry and the Hillsborough disaster. Alongside the many thousands of people who've campaigned for justice for so long, I want to personally thank her for showing the same commitment with respect to the contaminated blood tragedy. There are still questions to be answered on the detail of the inquiry. In welcoming this announcement, we must also be mindful of those who will never see its results, the more than 2,400 people who've tragically lost their lives. Many never even knew of the true scale of the scandal that was happening to them. Those affected and their families will be waiting anxiously to know that the Prime Minister's announcement will truly give them the justice they have so long been denied. But today, the Prime Minister has earned a place in history as someone who has listened to an issue which her predecessors had ignored and put party politics aside in the name of giving the people the basic right to answers, and for that she has my gratitude.
Order. The question is that this House has considered the need for an independent public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. Just before I call the first speaker from the backbench, I should say that at this stage I've not imposed any formal time limit, but a very substantial number of people wish to contribute, and therefore I know that the Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Stratford-upon-Avon, will exercise a magnificent self-denying ordinance in the length of his oration. Do we really have to have it? I know what I'm doing. I'm perfectly capable of handling the matter. If it's about the order of speeches, I know, I don't need to be advised by the right honourable gentleman in the handling of the debate. Let me just say, insofar as this wasn't clear, it was as a result, I'm afraid, of a failure of communication between the two front benches. These matters should be sorted out between the government and the opposition, not with people yapping at each other across the floor of the House or very close to the Speaker's chair. The Speaker is happy to give effect to what the two sides of the House want within reason, but that was not made easy on this occasion, and I am seeking to address the matter by consensus. I know the right honourable gentleman means well, and his offer of assistance is greatly appreciated, but I don't need to take him up on it on this occasion. Nadeem Zahawi.
Very grateful to you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join colleagues in paying tribute to the member for Kingston upon Hull North and the work she has done leading the all-party group, as well as the member for Worthing West, who has been a joint chairman of the all-party group. And I have been working with the victims in my constituency since 2011, so for the last 6 years. And I consider myself to be a new boy when it comes to this particular tragedy and scandal. The member for North East Bedfordshire has spent many hours tirelessly working on behalf of his constituents who have been victims, and may I also pay tribute to him. I know he'd wanted to be in this debate, but he couldn't because of government business. I really want to just thank the Prime Minister for listening to the victims of this extraordinary tragedy and colleagues in this House, and actually calling this inquiry. I want to acknowledge the Minister's response to colleagues that the government is in listening mode in terms of the terms of reference of this inquiry, and that they will put the victims at the heart of this inquiry. I think that is what the victims will expect and will be grateful for. Many victims, certainly my constituents, Claire Walton, initially did not want an inquiry. They wanted to see a settlement actually take place rather than an inquiry. But as new evidence was uncovered, and again I pay tribute to Andy Burnham in some of the work that he has done on this, and the journalist that the member for Kingston upon Hull North has cited in uncovering some of this evidence, my constituent Claire Walton has certainly changed her view and is very much supporting and looking forward to engaging with this inquiry. I just want to raise an important issue that the inquiry looks at, subsequent treatment of victims, and holds the bodies to account. Now, I have, on behalf of Claire Walton, been attempting to communicate with the McFarlane Trust, one of the 5 charities that was set up to help, and I say help victims because, in my experience, I have to say to the Minister, the McFarlane Trust has done anything but help my constituent. They have behaved in an utterly despicable way. They refuse to take meetings with my constituent or with me. I've requested meetings for the past 6 years, and they always come back with a reason why they can't have a meeting. They have bullied my constituent. The trustees of the McFarlane have bullied her, and they have fed her scraps. Those are her words, whilst at the same time having a charge over her property for all this time and making a profit on that charge. They refuse to discuss the future of the charge on her property. She wants to know, because the scheme administrator will soon be changed to the NHS Business Advisory Service. My constituent wants to know what will happen when that change takes place, and I hope the government can take some of this away and respond to it more fully at the appropriate time. The McFarlane Trust say they cannot give any more information until they have clarity from the Department of Health about transitional arrangements, and she really does want that clarity. But I hope that the Minister will, as his predecessor had intimated, that the McFarlane Trust is not for this world for much longer. I have, as I said, struggled to even be able to speak to them on the phone. My other constituent, Adrian Melson, feels particularly concerned about the discretionary payments. Many victims actually rely on the discretionary payments, and again, I hope that as the Minister begins to look at the evidence before him, he will look very closely at making sure that where discretionary payments have actually become something much more permanent, that they are recognised as that and not treated as discretionary, because the promise we made to our constituents under the previous Prime Minister, and I have to commend him for coming out and wanting to resolve this, is that no victim will financially suffer under any compensation structure that we put in place. I will take Mr. Speaker's very eloquent words on board and end there. Only just to say that this is not a party political issue. Many successive governments have failed the victims, and I hope now we actually come together, have this inquiry, but make sure there's a deadline. There is a clear timeline when we have an end.
The honourable gentleman, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Hull North, for the leadership she's given on this issue. On the coming together, it is important that this is a UK level, previous to devolution. So it's important that the Minister, and I thought he was going to be the next to speak in this debate, but it's clear that he works with the devolved administration. So any compensation in the future is at a UK level, so there are no second-class citizens in the United Kingdom.
And I think that point is taken on board by the victims, certainly, who looked at the Scottish settlement, certainly in my case with Adrian Melson. And I'm sure the Government is listening to the honourable friend's view on this. But let's come together and put a very clear timeline when the victims can, one, get justice on this, but also compensation. Thank you very much.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman. Just before more opposition members are minded to grumble about the fact that the Minister hasn't come in and that he isn't necessarily next, I would just point out that I was in receipt of representations from the opposition front bench on this matter. So some communication between the opposition front bench and the opposition backbench would be greatly advantageous to the conduct of our proceedings. Now, just before I call the Shadow Minister for Public Health, the Honourable Lady, the member for Washington and Sunderland West, can I gently implore her to speak for no more than 10 minutes, and preferably for fewer, because there are a lot of members who wish to contribute. After the Honourable Lady, the Minister, the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Ludlow, will helpfully set out the Government's position, and we will then open up to a wider debate. And I won't promise complete satisfaction, because I think that's without precedent in the House, but I will try to ensure that there are as many happy members as possible. Mrs Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for your guidance in this matter also. First and foremost, thanks must really go to the outstanding member, my honourable friend for Hull North, who has so valiantly campaigned on this issue for numerous years now. And without her and the dedicated resolve by her and all those that she cited who have been involved in this campaign, we would not be where we are today. Thanks must also go to the former member for Leigh, Andy Burnham, for his debate at the end of the last Parliament, which I had the honour of being present at, which helped add expediency to this issue with his commitment to go to the police with the evidence that he has if the Government failed to come forward with an inquiry to seek justice for those who have been neglected. For too long, the contaminated blood community have been simply failed by their government, ignored by those who have let the demands of the affected fall on deaf ears, which has left this community without justice. And it's very welcome, as we've heard, to hear in the news in the last hour or so, hour and a half, that this may be happening finally. And I do look forward to further details from the Minister in his response soon. And I'm very grateful for him allowing me to speak first, and and you, Mr Speaker, so he can answer questions that I would like to pose. But this, I feel, is all a rather unusual format, and that I had no prior knowledge that the format was going to be changed. And I hope other honourable members who are also going to speak and pose questions in the debate today will get a chance for some response from the Minister. So I don't know if you get 2 bites at the cherry or whether you will have to intervene to give other honourable members answers to their questions. I would also add that, you know, this emergency debate is very timely and allows us, the House, to have its voice heard fully, and which is right after the decades of neglect this community has faced. But at any point prior to 12:30, when it was announced in the news, the Minister could have come forward and made a statement which would have saved my honourable friend calling for the emergency debate yesterday. It does tend to feel that the order of these things has been a little forced, and it's sad that it has to be forced in this way, but we are where we are. Here on our benches, Labour are resolutely in favour of a Hillsborough-style public inquiry, as made clear in our manifesto a couple of months ago. I and my honourable friend pushed for that to be in our manifesto, and we still believe it's this style of inquiry which would get to the heart of the problems that unfolded in the 1980s and hold those who were to blame for this scandal to account before it is too late. Yet it is not just our own benches, but all those of the other parties represented in this, especially on this side of the House, who have made a commitment to stand up for those people seeking justice, as was so clearly documented in the joint letter from the leaders of every single opposition party here in this House, and also the DUP, I'm pleased to say, published on Sunday. In the debate on this issue last November, secured by my honourable friend for Hull North, we debated a whole host of issues this community face, including how they could be compensated for the terrible events that have occurred. But today we are here to debate the fight for justice, which should have happened a lot sooner. In my contribution, I want to impress upon the Minister 2 key points. Firstly, that categorically the previous 2 inquiries have not been sufficient in seeking justice, and this is the reason why a Hillsborough-style inquiry must be actioned. And secondly, the evidence presented so far is clear that if we are to have the truth and reconciliation of the murky covering up of this scandal, then the strongest of daylight must be shone on every aspect of this scandal, leaving no stone unturned. The 2 previous inquiries, the Archer inquiry of 2009 and the Penrose inquiry of 2015 in Scotland, did not go far enough in the eyes of the affected community in getting the truth and justice they deserve. Firstly, the Archer inquiry was not a government-backed one, and it failed to see Department of Health witnesses give evidence to the convened panel. The Penrose inquiry again did not go far enough in seeking the truth, as it was unable to compel witnesses from outside of Scotland, when at the time of the scandal most, if not all, of the decisions were made in Whitehall. So this failure to compel witnesses from outside of Scotland failed to seek the justice and answers that people from right across the UK deserve. On my second point, there are many allegations around this scandal, ranging from Department of Health officials destroying evidence as part of a cover-up to victims' medical details being tampered with to hide the cause of their infections. I will.
There are 2 particular issues that constituents of mine have said that the inquiry must consider. First, one of them has told me that he was infected with hepatitis C and exposed to the HIV virus, but was not informed of this by the NHS for years afterwards, and he wants to be assured that the inquiry will reveal why the truth was hidden. The second wants to know about this issue of doctors and scientists being paid by the drug companies and the precise nature of those deals, and he thinks that those have got to be really properly and rigorously exposed by this inquiry, so that we can get to the bottom of whatever vested interests existed during this scandal.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and the evidence has been well documented about the things of which he speaks, especially by the former member for Lee and the honourable member for Hull North. Now, those brave enough to come forward who have lived with these conditions, who have been at the sharp end of this heinous negligence and the recent uncovering reported in the Daily Mail last week, prove just how important it is that a Hillsborough-style inquiry is set up. In recent... I will, one more time, because I'm
very grateful for her giving way. Would she agree also that the self-sufficiency in blood products is an unauthorised report which could possibly be perpetuating inaccuracies and outright lies, as per my constituent's letter to me?
Sharon Hodgson.
This is all what will have to be looked into. All of this evidence needs to be looked at. And in recent days also, my office has received contact from individuals from my constituents affected by this scandal with intricate details that must be addressed. And it is important that those questions, no matter how small they may seem to some, are answered, as these are issues which have inextricably affected that person's whole life. It is issues like these that must be addressed, most importantly, so that those who've lived with the ramifications of this serious negligence can finally have the justice they deserve. Now, these are two of the reasons getting to the bottom of the allegations and evidence presented and having a full and frank inquiry that brings justice for the many people affected. This is why we must have this inquiry. And as the joint letter by the opposition leader said over the weekend, if a panel was to be convened, then it must disclose any and all documents related to the scandal, which involves the victims at every stage. It must compel all parties involved to participate with the disclosure process and not hinder justice any further, along with investigating the events leading up to the individual's infections, but also the aftermath, including allegations of medical details being tampered with, whether people were unknowingly tested for viruses without their knowledge, and if enough was done to identify those at risk of infection. There must also be an investigation as part of this inquiry into the role of profit-making American firms who supplied the blood factor concentrates to people with haemophilia. Whilst we know that none of this will bring back the loved ones of those who have died as a consequence of this scandal, or change the life circumstances of those who are alive today living with these conditions inflicted upon them, there is still something we can do, and that is to hold this inquiry. It is the very least we can do. The thousands of people affected by this scandal must be supported, and we must stand beside them in seeking justice, as is our duty as elected representatives of the public. I want to conclude with this final remark, Mr. Speaker. None of us here have a magic wand. I know our constituents all think we do, and we can't turn back time and stop this scandal from happening. Sadly, this power does not exist. But the power that does exist, at the behest of the Minister before us today, is that of facilitating the justice for those who live with the aftermath of this scandal. Here today we can send a message, a loud and strong message to those who campaign on this issue day in, day out, that Parliament has listened and is on their side. We in this House have heard them, we in this House are there with them, and we in this House will do all we can for them in their quest for justice. We cannot let them down. We can help facilitate the truth once and for all. Parliament is listening to the individuals who have spent decades fighting against the system to get the truth they seek, and the government must listen to Parliament. Parliament is saying, fix this, provide those thousands of people who never asked for this to happen to them with the justice they so rightly deserve. We cannot fail them any longer.
Call the Minister of State at the Department of Health, Minister Philip Dunne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to start by thanking you for making clear to the House the sequence in which we are speaking today in this very important debate. And I'd like to start my contribution by offering my personal apology to all those who've been affected by the tragedy of infected NHS-supplied blood and blood products. This has had a terrible impact on so many individuals and families, and I know that it has quite rightly been the subject of many debates in this chamber, prompted by the quite proper concern of members of both sides of this House over many years. There have been two previous inquiries on this issue: the privately funded Archer report, published in 2009, and the Scottish Government-funded Penrose inquiry report, published in 2015. But I'm aware that there have been several calls for a full independent inquiry over the years. In addition to these reports, the Department of Health has worked to bring greater transparency to the events at the time. Many documents related to blood safety, covering the period from 1970 to 1995, have been published and are available on the National Archives website. These documents provide a comprehensive picture of events and decisions made, and many of them were included in the documents reviewed by the Penrose Inquiry. However, I recognise that for those affected, these steps do not go far enough to provide the answers that they want and to get to the truth of what happened. In light of these concerns and of reports of new evidence and allegations of potential criminality, we think it is important to understand the extent of what is claimed and the wider issues that arise. I'm going to make some quick progress to get to the nub of the statement that I'm making. So, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to be able to confirm to the House that the Government intends to call an inquiry into the events that led to so many people being infected with HIV and or hepatitis C through NHS-supplied blood and blood products.
I'm very grateful and I'm very pleased with the news that he's just confirmed. Will he ensure that the process that is followed, and I very much support the Hillsborough-style inquiry, facilitates the ability to bring criminal charges so that the full force of the law can be applied to anyone who may be guilty of criminal wrongdoing?
I'm going to come on directly to the form that the independent inquiry should take, which I hope will help address the honourable gentleman's question. So we've heard already today that there have been calls for an inquiry based on the model that was used to investigate the Hillsborough tragedy, a so-called Hillsborough-style panel. This would allow for a sensitive investigation of the issues, allowing those affected and their families close personal engagement with an independent and trusted panel. There have also been suggestions that only a formal statutory inquiry led by a senior judge under the Inquiries Act 2005 will provide the answers that those affected want. Such an inquiry would have the power to compel witnesses and written evidence, one of the apparent shortcomings from the previous reports. The Government can see that there are merits in both approaches, and to ensure that whatever is established is in the interests of those affected, we will engage with the affected groups and interested parties, including the all-party parliamentary group, before taking a final decision on the type of inquiry.
Will my honourable friend give way? I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I wonder if he could tell this House whether the terms of the inquiry will allow for any recommendations to be made about the correct levels of compensation to those who've been affected.
I will make a little bit of progress and endeavour to answer that during my remarks. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and ministers at the Department of Health will be meeting with those affected and their families so that we can discuss the issues and understand their preferences directly for the style, scope and duration of the inquiry.
I'm very grateful for what he's saying. I just wondered, though, can he give some time estimate for when these meetings are going to take place? Because I have to say my experience of the Department of Health is that in this issue, deadlines are sort of not met and things have to be dragged onto the floor of the House to get ministers to respond. So is there a set timetable when a decision will be made and these meetings held?
I'm sure the Honourable Lady, who's taken such an active lead in encouraging inquiries, will want to make sure that we get it right. So we will take the time that is necessary in order to consult with colleagues, with interested groups, and our intent would be to be able to come back to this House as soon as practical, I would anticipate in the autumn.
He's mentioned the Department. He's mentioned the Department of Health. He will know that, for example, my constituents who live in Wales live under a devolved administration, but were infected in hospitals, in this case in Liverpool. What consultation is he undertaking with the existing Welsh Assembly and the schemes that they're running, and also the liability ultimately for any objectives?
We do recognise that there is a legitimate interest from all constituent nations within the United Kingdom, and as many of these incidents happened prior to devolution, we do intend to consult with devolved governments. I'm just going to take an intervention from mine.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and will he agree with me? Well, it's quite right. The inquiry will have to give answers to the victims of this scandal and their families, quite rightly. There's also going to be a great interest to the conclusions of the inquiry to this House and to the wider public to ensure that the circumstances that led historically to this scandal can never be repeated again in the future.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. I'm going to make a little more progress before responding to other colleagues regarding matters which are devolved. Regardless of the style of the inquiry, it is our intention that the inquiry covers the whole of the UK, and we will therefore be in direct contact with counterparts in Wales, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland to discuss this with them and seek their views before determining those aspects of the inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I apologise to the House and to the Minister and to you, Mr. Speaker, for not being here at the very beginning of this very, very important debate. The Minister has very kindly indicated, in fact, he's going to consult on this inquiry. Is going to be UK-wide. The Minister will, of course, know we have no assembly. There is no corresponding Minister of Health in Northern Ireland, which is absolutely disgraceful, I have to say, and there's no prospect of having one this side of the autumn. So how and who will the Minister liaise with in Northern Ireland in the absence of the Assembly?
Well, we'll be looking to the Northern Ireland office to facilitate discussions with officials and representatives in Northern Ireland.
Full to the Minister. On this point that my right honourable friend raised about devolution, is he saying to the House today that this is a UK-wide inquiry and that the consultation will be across the United Kingdom for them to consult in, but that the inquiry itself will be UK-wide, so constituents like Mr and Mrs Hutchinson in my constituency will have equality to any outcome of this inquiry?
The scope of the inquiry will be determined as part of the discussions which I've indicated will be had over coming weeks and short number of months. But our intent is that the devolved administrations and the residents within them will have full access to participate in the inquiry, irrespective of where they live or were infected. The Government intends to update the House once these discussions have completed, and I would encourage colleagues with a specific interest to engage themselves in discussions through the all-party group or other groups that may exist. In the meantime, if anyone in this House or outside has any evidence of criminality, they should take that evidence to the police as soon as possible. If anyone has any other evidence that they want the inquiry to consider, I would ask that they submit it to the inquiry once it has been established. The Government will be writing to all those in receipt of payments from the current schemes to make sure that they all know about today's announcement and to inform them of next steps.
I thank the Minister for giving way and very much welcome the comments he's giving so far. Will he confirm that in terms of drawing up the scope of the inquiry, we'll be careful not to do anything that would endanger any future trials? And also, would he also further emphasise that anyone with information must make sure it's made available to the police?
My honourable friend will recollect from the recent Hillsborough inquiry that it gave rise to certain information which was made available to the police, which led to certain charges being made. We would envisage that any inquiry that is established would have the ability to do the same thing if that is appropriate. I must make a little bit of progress because Mr. Speaker has encouraged me to take 10 minutes so that everyone can make their own contributions, and I've already exceeded that. So I would just like to move on to take this opportunity to inform the House that implementing the reforms to the infected blood ex gratia support schemes remains a priority for the Government. And this is why, as David Cameron established a year or so ago, within this spending review period until 2020-21, up to £125 million of additional funding has been added to the budget for the ex gratia support scheme. This more than doubles the annual spend over the spending review period. The second consultation on scheme reform, which closed on the 17th of April this year, received over 250 responses. The consultation contained proposals for a special category mechanism that would allow those with stage 1 hepatitis C to apply for the higher annual payment, greatly increasing the number of individuals eligible for the higher payment. The responses are being looked at, and the consultation response will be published in due course. All the annual payments will remain linked to the Consumer Price Index and will be disregarded for tax and benefit purposes.
And for what he said earlier on about input to the inquiry, as the new chair of the All-Party Group on HIV and AIDS, I'm sure members of the All-Party Group want to input. But I really want to press him on this point about the liability and the financial liabilities arising from this inquiry and the impact of devolution. Will he guarantee that no matter where anybody was infected or where they live now, that they will be treated with equality across the United Kingdom when it comes to any financial liabilities and payments arising from this inquiry?
I've just been describing the additional contribution that was made to the financial scheme for England. It will be for the inquiry to decide whether they want to make recommendations regarding financial arrangements, and at present I'm not in a position to give him the confirmation that he's looking for. I think that will have to come through the inquiry.
My constituent Leslie Hughes was infected with hepatitis C in 1970, but this was discovered only about 3 years ago. Will any consideration be given to those long years of suffering when the compensation scheme is put into effect?
I can offer my sympathy and to my honourable friends, my right honourable friend's constituent, for the challenges she finds herself in. I think we have to say at this point that it will be down to individuals to make their applications. We will be responding to the consultation, as I said, in due course, and I would strongly encourage my right honourable friend to make representations on her behalf to the inquiry when it's established. I think the honourable gentleman was first.
I thank the Minister for giving way. He's been extremely generous. Could I just press him on the issue of health records? Is that many of the families are still trying to establish what has actually happened while the Minister is discussing the scope of the inquiry. If there are any issues about families obtaining health records, that we can write to the Minister on that issue.
I think it would be appropriate to write to the inquiry once that is established. The point was made earlier about ensuring that medical records, if there's evidence of tampering of medical records, that should be made available to the inquiry, and I completely concur with that. I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring my remarks to a conclusion by thanking those on both sides of the House who worked tirelessly on this issue over the years, and I'd particularly like to add my voice to others who have already spoken to commend the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North, who I know has spoken not only very powerfully today, but on many occasions in this House and for many years on this subject. And I'd also like to commend my colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Worthing West, who co-chairs the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and to thank, as she did, members past and present of that group, notably the former chairman, Jason McCartney, late of this parish. And finally, I'd like to add my thanks to ministerial colleagues who've been handling this delicate issue for in previous administrations, in particular my friend, the member for North East Bedfordshire, who's worked so hard not just for his constituents but for all of those who've been affected by this tragedy.
Order. If I could appeal to the SNP spokesperson, certainly not to exceed 10 minutes and preferably less. The Minister took a little longer, but he did take several interventions and was setting out the Government's position, but there's no requirement or need for the Honourable Lady to take quite as long. Dr Philippa Whitford.
Very much, Mr Speaker. As the Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull said, 2,400 people have died from the worst disaster in NHS history. Now, this was due to a shortage of blood and clotting factors that led to the NHS sourcing products from America. The problem is that people with haemophilia in men or von Willebrand's disease in women who get factor 9, these concentrates are made from thousands of samples. And the moment you have 1 or 2 people within that collection, you are starting to have the virus. And that's why they are affected at a much higher rate than people who had a single blood transfusion. And the problem is, we're talking about decades that this goes back and has not been properly dealt with, as has been mentioned in the Chamber already. Now, in the 2 years I've been in the House, we've had multiple debates, statements and urgent questions on this issue, and I too pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for keeping at it with the all-party group. But most of that has been around support, and it was only last July that finally this government came forward with a strengthened support package for these people. It's important to recognise this is not compensation. These are ex gratia support payments. They do not recognise the loss and suffering of the victims of contaminated blood. And that only seemed to come about after the Scottish Government came up with a much more generous package in a much larger lump sum, ongoing payments, and very particularly 75% pension to the spouse and bereaved families, who at the moment still do not get sufficient support here in England. And that is not right. The idea that someone who loses a partner to this scandal is not compensated. Now, what we heard in March of this year, a mere 7 months after that, was that the government was consulting on perhaps restricting who all would qualify for the highest payments, and that these payments would not be subject to index linking. The youngest victim remaining is approximately 35. They have a whole lifetime to go through. It may be a shortened lifetime in comparison to us, but we cannot have that people are suddenly left in poverty further down the line. And these things need to be dealt with. And I welcome the Minister's commitment that the CPI index linking will actually go ahead. We may need a debate on support, but that isn't what this debate is about. I give way.
I am very grateful. I'm reluctant to interrupt the Honourable Lady's remarks, but the support extends to Wales as well, not just to England, of course. And of course, it is a £10,000 payment, as far as I understand, for spouses in Wales as well. Is it her understanding that, in terms of reference of the inquiry, will include the actions of governments in Wales and in Scotland and possibly Northern Ireland, as well as what has happened in England? I had intended to ask the Minister, but couldn't get in.
Well, obviously, the Scottish Government had an inquiry, the Penrose inquiry, but I would assume, as the Minister has committed to, that any inquiry going forward will look at the whole of the UK. It must be remembered that the decisions that led to this were taken here and in Whitehall. This is before devolution. Governments like the Scottish Government have tried to step up and support their constituents and citizens who've been affected by it, but actually getting the answers to what caused this is in this place. I'll give way, but I won't be able to give way too much.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and would she agree that the sense of lack of trust has been enhanced by documents such as the self-sufficiency in blood products, which was a DOH document, but which many people felt was inaccurate and indeed outright lies?
I think obviously all of these things will have to be looked at by the inquiry itself. And I think documents, patients' records, things that were altered, things that were hidden, and things that are hiding behind public interest barriers now all need to, as in the case of Hillsborough, be opened up so that light is shone into that. Now, the Penrose inquiry was Scotland only. The Department of Health was invited to take part at the time and turn it into a nationwide, UK-wide inquiry, but they declined. And Penrose did not have the right to summon either documents or people, and that was one of its key weaknesses. Now, I remember at the time in the 80s when this scandal started to unfold, and as a surgeon who, of course, uses blood on their patients, I remember how shocked I was at the mere thought that an action I might have taken could have harmed a patient that I was looking after. And I certainly set about in my elective surgery to chase every single blood cell to avoid spilling blood, using electrocautery, all sorts of modern techniques. And if you wheel out my staff from my theatre, they'll moan about how long I used to spend doing that. But if you're dealing with someone who's been hit by a bus, you have no choice. I remember a criticism in response to Penrose in 2015, saying they were surprised that clinicians showed so much trust in the quality of blood. But a clinician who's using hundreds of drugs and implants and machines and blood products must be able to trust them. We have no mechanism personally to check them. That is the role of government and all the agencies of government. That's why we have licensing and inspections, and why, when there is suspicion of harm, action must be taken. As I said, that failure to act, that hiding, that not dealing with it at the time, happened pre-devolution, and this inquiry must take account of it. In particular, we know that at a conference in 1980 in Glasgow, clinicians were already raising concerns about seeing change in liver function in patients who were receiving blood concentrate for haemophilia. There is a meeting that we've obviously all read about recently in 1981 of, this is the UK Blood Transfusion Service Research Committee, which recognised about 50 patients a year developing some form of liver damage. And yet the decision at that meeting appears to be to let that continue and simply study it and use these patients as a way of developing a test for what was known at the time as non-A, non-B hepatitis. I think it is really important in this inquiry that we ensure that we are looking at all of this. The official from the Department of Health and Social Security at that meeting would not attend Penrose. These people need to be called by this inquiry. So going forward, of course, it must include the families, the victims, so that we are sensitive to what it is they want to know. It isn't just government, but producers, and not just producers in America. I think we try to make ourselves feel better because we blame it on the States, where people bought blood, where people with addictions and poverty and prisoners were used. In the mid-70s, prisoners in this country were also used, and it is claimed that that was encouraged by the Home Office as part of prisoner rehabilitation. We need those documents. We need to understand if that decision was made. The UK producers have often been found wanting in the quality of product that they came up with. So we mustn't pat ourselves in the back and imagine that the UK product was somehow safe and this was all due to the US. We need to follow this right down and get the answers. I think that the people have been failed so many times over and over. It is crucial that this does not happen again. I think that we need to keep the government on their toes. We need to have reports back from this inquiry as it's set up so that we know what it is it's going to actually look into. Because if we fail to get answers this time, and in particular fail to actually deliver compensation for lives lost, for suffering, failure to get a mortgage or insurance, the costs of care, then we'll have failed them all over again.
Mims Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate the honourable member for Kingston upon Hull for securing this important debate today. And I was also in this chamber when the former member for Lee raised very concerning issues that needed to be looked at in this new inquiry, and that struck a chord with me, and I'm delighted to be back in the chamber to see this happening. Like many members across this House on both sides, I've been contacted by constituents who've told me about their experiences and how contaminated blood has affected them, their family life and their friends. Every so often, in the experience that you have as a constituency MP, you meet the saddest constituents that tell you the most heartbreaking stories, and you sit there week in, week out, and these resonate with you. But it's not a story for these victims. It's daily life. It's wrecked lives where nothing has been done wrong by their own accord
It is pure injustice. So it's clear that destructive effects of contaminated blood products used decades ago have continued to daily affect people's lives in a devastating way that, frankly, when I've heard the stories of how it's affected people, it has indeed lived with me, and I can understand the campaigning nature that has been brought to this House on all sides, and I'm delighted to bring my experience on behalf of my constituents. And today we finally recognise, and this government has done this and is ready to tackle this injustice, and I'm delighted to see that that is being done in the name of the victims and the families who've done nothing to bring this on themselves. After I became the MP for Eastleigh in May 2015, I met one of my constituents from Bishopstoke, Gary Webster, who has been left coping with HIV, hepatitis C and possibly variant CJD following NHS blood products which were used in the 1980s as a routine procedure to treat his haemophilia. Of course I will.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady giving way. One of the important things in this will be that it goes far enough back. The decision made to heat treat albumin for hepatitis B was in the mid-60s, and yet we didn't treat concentrate. So we need to make sure all these conditions are included.
I thank the Honourable Lady for that input, and I think absolutely the experience that you bring to this and that all our constituents can bring to this to make sure we do go back far enough is absolutely right. So last year, Gary attended a debate that we had here once again to discuss this really heartbreaking issue. Now, Gary went on to attend a specialist school in Alton, where he was one of many haemophiliacs who were at school there. And he told me that he kept in contact with around 100 students who had all been affected by contaminated blood. Now, he, along with those other students, continued to stay friends with those students, but only now, I believe, around 20 are still alive. These were all fellow students who contracted illnesses through blood products that they received because of haemophilia. And I know that, tragically, his story is similar to thousands across this country. And I know from other constituents, some who've wished not to be named, have had grave financial burdens placed upon them and their families as a result of the diseases which they've contracted, which has affected their lives through this contaminated blood. It is only right that we support those whose lives have been significantly affected by these contaminated products. And therefore, I am very pleased about the additional support which will be provided by the government to those who have been roundly affected, and particularly pleased to see the annual payments for hepatitis stage 2 will increase up to 15,500 and then going up to 18,500 in 2018 and 19. And the payments to those affected with HIV and hepatitis stage 2 also seeing their payments going up to 36,500 by 2018 and 19, and that these payments will be linked to CPI. Now, this will help support all constituents that we know have been affected, but I know also, speaking to Gary and others, the real hardship that these conditions have brought to the challenges in their life and the difficulty of working where possible and being able to bring up and support their families in a way that they would have liked to have chosen to had they not have been affected. So there's been almost £400 million paid out to those affected by 5 different organisations funded by the Department of Health, and I'm delighted with the additional £125 million which has been committed by this government for additional funding for a reform scheme which will double the department's annual spend to the scheme over the next 5 years. And this must go to the people who really need it, and that should absolutely be noted, because I know that people have made daily life decisions which have been really difficult because of the impact financially that they've had. Yes, I'll give way.
Honourable Lady for giving way. She talks about a reform scheme, and there are some constituents who've fallen outside the existing scheme. My constituent Sharon Moore, who suffered from a transfusion of contaminated blood, but she has been told she's outside the criteria. would she urge the government to look at cases again under the new scheme to make sure that people are not missed and not excluded unnecessarily?
I thank the honourable member for bringing that point forward. I know as an MP there is nothing more frustrating when you hear people just fall outside of the bracket. That's the worst place to be, and I'm sure the scope of this inquiry perhaps maybe give us a chance to look at that. So this government has done significantly more than other governments to protect those who have been affected, and I know that there is a commitment to ensure that we're currently working to pull those 5 schemes together, the fairly complex nature of dealing with this into a transferred scheme in 2017. But these people have complicated and difficult lives anyway, and I think it's only right that we make it easier to get the support that the victims need. And I'm so pleased that Prime Minister has announced this morning, and that there will be a full and wide-ranging inquiry into this tragedy. And I'm pleased it will be the type of inquiry drawn together by the victims to support and suit the victims, that they will finally have a voice, the strongest voice possible, to get the most and fullest answers which they absolutely deserve. And it's only right that this consultation will be held together with those affected by this terrible injustice, so that their families also have a voice. And it's my hope this inquiry will provide the answers to those that are so looking for it. In particular, issues of concern regarding the criminality. When I heard that in this House, that was extremely concerning. So a vehicle that we now have to get those voices heard, so that if there is anything that should be going through the courts process, that we can do something about it. So that we now have an opportunity with this inquiry that no voice will be lost. The victims and their families will get the right inquiry, the fullest compensation, and the answers they rightly deserve.
Yeah. Order. Can I just advise the House that, with the exception of the maiden speaker whom I'm about to call, colleagues should be thinking in terms of speeches of 5 minutes each, or at most 6, if the chair is to accommodate everybody. I'm sure there are colleagues who would like to expatiate eloquently and at length, and on other occasions they might be free to do so. But that will have to wait for the long winter evenings, I say to the honourable member for Hammersmith, that lie ahead. Before that, I hope that we can give a warm and enthusiastic, encouraging welcome to our maiden speaker, Annalisa Dodds.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very, very grateful to my honourable friend for securing this debate. As the new MP for Oxford East, I must say that it's a shame to me that it was the Oxford Haemophilia Centre which produced blood products which resulted in many people contracting blood-borne diseases, and further, that guidance from the centre in the early 1980s advocated the use of humans to test infectivity. I will repeat that, the use of humans to test infectivity. However, I'm very proud of those people from Oxford who have campaigned for so many years for justice, along with many others mentioned by my honourable friend. Their fight has been simply, as we've heard, for truth and for accountability, so events like these can never happen again. As I start my maiden speech, I'd like to dedicate my words to them and to all those other people in Oxford who fought for justice against all the odds, not least also the survivors of the Bullfinch sexual abuse scandal, whose bravery has been remarkable and an inspiration. Mr. Speaker, I'm enormously grateful to the people of Oxford East for electing me as their representative. In doing so, I of course take over from Andrew Smith, who served us for 3 decades as our MP and who many people on all sides of this House knew very well. Like many people, Andrew came initially to Oxford unsure of whether it would become his home, but quickly recognised the potential of our great city, not least because, as a student, he met very quickly his wonderful wife Val, who also was known by many people in this House. Val was an incredibly powerful advocate for the community of Blackbird Leys, which she served as a county and city councillor for many years. Her wisdom and her kindness is still very sadly missed by many of us. Andrew's undoubtedly best known in Oxford East as a diligent constituency MP who cares passionately about our city and all of its people, including, of course, those living in his home community of, again, Blackbird Leys. But Andrew also had a very distinguished career in Parliament, including serving in the Cabinet as Chief Secretary to the Treasury from 1999 to 2002, and then as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions from 2002 to 2004. Andrew's work with others lifted more than 1 million pensioners and 500,000 children out of poverty, helped restore the national finances, a piece of history often ignored or sadly distorted in this House, and brought in some of the biggest increases in health and overseas aid spending our country has ever seen. Andrew also presided over groundbreaking disability rights legislation, set up the Pension Protection Fund, helped bring in the pension credit and many, many more transformative initiatives. Andrew is nonetheless an incredibly humble man. He always stressed how his achievements came about through working with others, either in this House or in Oxford. In fact, Andrew is so humble that when he was in the Cabinet running Britain's welfare state, his own television was so dilapidated that it had to be whacked many times before it would actually work. He's very intelligent, but he's also very straightforward, without any airs or graces, and he's immensely respected for it. And I'm sure that members from all sides of this House will wish him very well for a long and very happy retirement. Oxford East could be imagined as a constituency filled only with gleaming spires, detectives driving Aston Martins and mysterious university dons. But while Oxford East boasts 2 excellent universities and bustles with students during term time, Oxford also has an impressive industrial heritage and enormous further industrial potential with the right infrastructure investment and support. What was the Press steel plant, now BMW Cowley, produces nearly 250,000 mini cars every year. Its engineers, technicians and apprentices are amongst the best in the world. Oxford as a city voted to remain in the EU, although some areas in the city had a majority to leave. Whether people voted to leave or to remain, no one voted to deny our city its potential. It's essential that European markets remain open to businesses like BMW Cowley, and that we retain Oxford's many and various links with European and global science, as well as protecting those EU citizens who've made their roots in our city. In fact, Oxford is a city that's always looked outwards, as the first ever Oxfam shop on Broad Street reminds us. People with their roots from all over the world call Oxford East their home. I'm very proud we have 5 mosques in my constituency, many different Christian churches and substantial Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist and Jewish populations. But I feel the potential of many people from all of our communities in Oxford East is currently being held back. Yesterday, I attended the funeral of Bill Buckingham, who'd been a Labour councillor and campaigner in Oxford East for 70 years. He died at the age of 96. Bill was amongst many who came back after serving our country in the Second World War, determined that Lloyd George's promise after the First World War now had to be turned into a socially inclusive reality, with homes built for heroes as part of mixed communities to be proud of. As Bevan put it at the time, we needed high-quality housing in Britain where the doctor, grocer, butcher and the farm labourer could all be neighbours without social distinction. Well, what if that ambitious vision survives now? House prices and rents in Oxford are the least affordable in Britain outside London. Renters of homes have fewer rights than if they were renting a sofa or a fridge. The rules for housing benefit have been changed, so people whose families have lived in Oxford for generations are being forced out of their city for the crime of merely earning an average, not above average wage. And to pay for the right to buy in housing association properties, up to 1/3 of Oxford's remaining council stock could vanish. As far as I'm concerned, people doing their best to bring up their children on low incomes in Oxford are today's heroes and heroines, often running between more than one job to make ends meet. I must say it comes as a slap in the face to them when they hear politicians refusing to admit there's such a thing as in-work poverty, and I was disturbed to hear that in this House last week repeatedly. Britain, and especially Oxford, urgently needs more genuinely affordable homes, with affordability not covering homes worth £400,000, as is currently the case. Renters need stronger rights, and they need, above all, a system that recognises houses as homes, places to live, and not merely investment opportunities. We also, of course, need to unlock the potential of our communities and not allow them to be asset stripped. I live on the Rose Hill estate in Oxford with my family, and I'm very pleased some of them are here today. It's a wonderful, friendly place, albeit one where almost half the children on the estate grew up in poverty. Bill Buckingham, who I mentioned earlier, along with many other local people, kept Rosehills Community Centre going through thick and thin, even when it burned down. And now we have a new centre on my estate. But other community facilities have been run down in recent years. I loved meeting other parents during baby sessions at the Children's Centre when I had my first child 4 years ago. As you can see, he's quite grown up now, albeit a little bit tired now. But by the time my daughter arrived 18 months ago, there were no more baby sessions available. Instead, the Children's Centre is only available for supervised contact sessions and for 2 hours a week of supervised play. Community spaces like children's centres may not grab the headlines, but for many people, they mean the difference between loneliness and friendship, between ill health and well-being, and between division and neighbourliness. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, Oxford East and its incredible people have so much potential, but too often I feel they're being held back. As their MP, I'm ambitious for our city and its people, and I'll devote the time they've given me in this place to ensure a better, brighter and fairer future for them and for people like them across this country.
Thank you. Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also start by paying tribute to the Honourable Lady from Kingston upon Hull North for her leadership and persistence on this issue, as well as my honourable friend from Stratford-on-Avon for their work on tireless work on this issue. But to welcome, of course, the Minister's statement that a public inquiry will happen on this most important of issues, and the Prime Minister's clearly listened to views across the House on this particular matter. It was one of my first surgery appointments, that Richard and his wife came to see me to tell me about his story. Richard was a haemophiliac who was sent to a physically disabled school in Hampshire when he was 11. And for 6 years he was given hundreds of thousands of units of factor 8. Prior to that point in time, he'd been given something called a cryoprecipitate, which was perfectly workable in terms of moderating his condition. But this new factor 8 was seen as prophylactic, so it would prevent any occurrences of his haemophilia and the dangers that would cause. So, and this obviously meant for Richard a lifetime of a change in his lifetime. At that point in time, there were 75 people in that school alongside Richard. Sadly, 64 of them are no longer with us. Many of those young people dying in their early teens. So, and it was an added double tragedy when Richard and his wife told me the fact that having got the very good news later in life when he got married and they decided to have children, due to the risk of his own hepatitis affecting that newborn child, they'd had to have a late termination of that baby. So they were childless as well as affected by these terrible diseases throughout their lifetime. Can I also, of course, I neglected to congratulate the Honourable Member for Oxford East for her very, very fine maiden speech, and she certainly made a far better job of it than I did of mine when I stood here 2 years ago. So some tremendous words there, and highly relevant to the topic as well. So I'm sure she'll make many fine further contributions in the years ahead. Very happy to.
Congratulated the Honourable Lady on her maiden speech. She was talking about the challenges faced by people who were affected by contaminated blood in having children. Does he agree with me that the inquiry needs to consider the position of those people, and particularly my constituent, who had one round of IVF treatment that was covered by the NHS but wasn't entitled to a second one, and the second round of IVF he had to pay for himself, and that kind of compensation should also be considered in the round when we're looking at the effect of this on people earlier on.
My old friend is absolutely right. There are so many tragic implications from these terrible diseases, and the treatments they received. It was absolutely clearly of no fault of their own, and of course they had no knowledge that these treatments would have any adverse impact on their health. Another one of my constituents, Helen, who moved to my constituency in 2006. But Helen was infected in the 1980s, but it was only when she moved to my area with a new GP that she was diagnosed as having the difficulty with hepatitis. And so many consequent health problems. She's had 4 strokes, diabetes, rheumatoid osteoporosis. So, and this has had a huge impact on her life. She calls herself a ticking time bomb in terms of her own health. Had to relocate back from France, wanted to set up a new life there with her husband and 2 children. I spoke to both my constituents today who talked about quite incredibly how they seem to carry these burdens so lightly, certainly in terms of when they speak to me about these issues, but they've moved on from the principal issues, which was compensation. Now that what they want is a public inquiry to get to the bottom of this issue. It is about answers. I'm not saying compensation is not important, it's hugely important, particularly for their spouses and their children. But today they want answers. What was known? Very happy to
friend for giving way, and he's making a very good case. And would it not be the case that now is the chance for transparency to be at the core of the inquiry? We welcome the government's inquiry, we welcome the funding so far, but isn't transparency what it's all about?
I absolutely agree, and I welcome, I think the Minister may confirm, if he gets a chance to make remarks at the end of the debate, but confirm the government has, I believe, released all the documents it has in its possession on this issue. It's absolutely right, we should have full transparency, but also be able to interview key witnesses who are involved in this tragedy. I think the key is what was known is one of the biggest outstanding questions we had. Helen told me that she felt, despite the fact that she didn't find out to 20 years after she was infected, the hospital had known for years, for her words, which is a tragic set of circumstances. Richard sent me a passage. He'd found done some research, and apparently in 1975, Dr. Joseph Garrett Allen, Professor of Surgery at Stanford University in California, wrote to Dr. William Maycock, head of the transfusion service in the UK, that was early as 1975, to warn him that severe dangers of using US pooled plasma saw some high-risk paid Skid Row donors and prisoners, saying it was extraordinarily hazardous. So these are the questions that my constituents want answers to. What was known about the risks? Whether Parliament should be informed about that change in approach away from self-sufficiency into imported products. What was found out and why, when things were found out about these issues, why the products weren't withdrawn. Was it a cover-up? Was it negligence? Was it a paternalistic approach by clinicians? Was it simply incompetence? These are the answers. These are the questions that we need answers to. I welcome the fact this government has done more than any other in terms of compensation. It has now done more than any other in terms of transparency and bringing forward a public inquiry, which I very much welcome. I hope I can play my part in making sure my constituents get these answers and all the other people affected by this terrible tragedy, for my constituents, for their loved ones, and we get clear answers and resolution to many of these questions.
Order. Can I just remind honourable members that the Speaker did ask if speeches could be kept to around 5 minutes. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would first like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull for the sterling work that she has done in this issue, and to Andy Burnham and to so many others who have pursued this relentlessly over the years. It's testament to their commitment that they have kept going with this, even when all hope seemed to be lost. I'd also like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Oxford East on her excellent maiden speech, and I'm sure we have a lot of common ground there and hope to work together over the coming months and years. Madam Deputy Speaker, before Parliament broke up back in April, Andy Burnham laid a challenge to all the parties in this House to put in their manifesto a commitment to the victims of contaminated blood, and I'm very pleased and proud that my party saw fit to do so, saying within the manifesto that victims of contaminated blood products deserve answers. In 2008, the SNP Scottish Government established the Penrose Public Inquiry, which reported in 2015. In Government, we've also worked with stakeholder groups to develop a substantially improved compensation scheme, which is now the best in the UK. SNP MPs will support a full public inquiry on this issue in the rest of the UK, and I am very proud to stand by those words here today. I'm incredibly pleased and surprised to hear that the Government has changed their stance on this issue, because when we met last in April, it didn't feel as though anything much more was going to happen on this. And the change in public attitude, the change in attitude from the Government is very, very welcome, and I wouldn't want to appear churlish in this at all, but it certainly is a changed Parliament, and the changed numbers in this Parliament do make some things that seemed impossible before now open for debate, and I am very glad to see that. There's been recognition in the debate so far of the limitations of Penrose and what the Scottish Government could do. We could not compel witnesses to attend. We had a limited remit to consider negligence. So it is good that we have now this opportunity to re-look at all these issues, and I'm glad to hear the Government commit as well to work with the devolved administrations, because we now do have the experience of having done so, of having gone through this inquiry, limited as it was, and I hope to hear more about the ways in which the Scottish Government and victims in Scotland will be brought in as part of that process. My own constituent, who I mentioned in the debate in April 2016, Maria, I've not been able to reach her to ask what her views are on this issue, because it has been so very late in the day that we get the debate and we get the announcement from the Government. But I want to put on record again that Maria contracted Hep C in 1981 through a miscarriage when she received a blood transfusion following that. She didn't find out for many years after that, even when she sought a diagnosis. It took 2 years to get that. And she would want this House to know, certainly, in the 36 years she has lived with Hep C, that she doesn't want charity, she doesn't want vouchers, she doesn't want handouts. She wants to be treated fairly and with dignity, and that is the very least that she deserves through this process.
Of course. I think for giving way, the Oxford Haemophilia Centre serves my constituents, and so I thank the Honourable Member for Kingston for bringing this to our attention. Do you agree that it's not just transparency but also justice that those victims want? And would she also agree with me that if we do find evidence of a cover-up, that those individuals should also face the full force of the law?
I absolutely agree, and I'm glad that she raised that point, because that's where I was moving on to next, because without that justice, these victims will never feel as though they have been well served. They will feel as though they have lost out as part of this process and that there has been no justice. And this inquiry needs to look at the issues around medical records being changed, because there must have been some clear instruction from somebody to do so. These kinds of cover-ups do not happen on their own, and we must find those lines of responsibility that said to people, delete those records, don't tell people about this, test people but don't let them know. All of these things that are outstanding must be answered. We must find out what was known, when and by whom. In the search for answers as well, we must recognise that some of these answers can't be given because they are held in the United States, and we must find ways, if ministers can reach out, can speak to their counterparts in other parts of the world, to try and find answers to these questions. If there are means of doing so in cooperation with the American Government, these must be found as well. We must have confidence in the processes that we have today as well, and I understand that the US started screening blood donations in 1983. We didn't start to do so until 1991, and I'm conscious every time I go to donate blood that the integrity of the system is based on my honesty at every stage, and we must find better ways to ensure that our own systems today are as robust with the greatest of integrity that we can have. In conducting this inquiry, the Government has said that they're going to reach out to those receiving funds through the current schemes. I would hope that that's done in cooperation with the devolved administrations as well, where they are responsible for that. And I would encourage the Government also to carry out advertising, to seek ways in as wide a means as possible of contacting people and letting them know. Because it may be that somebody has died and the family members aren't aware of this. And we must try and reach out as widely as we can through advertising, through social media, through whatever means are at our disposal, to make sure that as many people can be involved in this inquiry as possible. In the inquiry as well, we need to make sure that people are supported to attend and supported to give evidence, because this may be a very traumatic experience for some people. They may need counselling and they may need financial support to attend and to produce documents and to make sure that documents reach the inquiry. And in speaking about the documents as well, the Haemophilia Society have said in their response to this, that we must treat documents with the utmost care and protection. People quite rightly have huge scepticism about their documents now, and we must make sure that the integrity of the documents is right, and that people can trust that if they submit evidence, that evidence will not be lost. And that goes for government evidence as well as private evidence belonging to members of the public as well. We have waited too long, far, far too long, for justice on this. I would encourage the government, when they carry out this inquiry, that there is that sense of urgency maintained, that this is not dragged out over many, many years without answer and without going back to the victims. People have waited far too long for justice. They should not have to wait very much longer.
Here. Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to see you in your place. It's the first time I've had the honour to be here when you are sitting, because you should be in the chair. I just want to make a few comments, because my involvement in this was, I think, as perhaps the second Minister for Public Health that the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull had the, I nearly said great misfortune, to come and see, as she did, with all the vim and vigour that she has brought to this campaign over 7 long years. It's 7 long years, and it's too long that it has taken for justice finally to have been brought about. But when I think, and I think I'm right in saying that when the Honourable Lady came to say me, the biggest concern was, yes, there was this burning injustice. And frankly, it just, from my point of view, it just felt wrong. There was something that wasn't right. Couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something inherently that led you somewhere along the line to take the view that there's something not right. And often that was supported, if I may say, by the attitude of some that I came across who wanted not just to sweep it under the carpet, but just not want to deal with it any longer and sort of try somehow to move on to other areas about how we could help these unfortunate victims. And at that time, there was the second part of the great injustice, which I want to talk a little more about, which was about the money. So there were two points to all of this. There is the great injustice of the fact that this terrible scandal happened, and it happened decades ago, and governments of both political colours, and in fact the third colour of the coalition, frankly failed to grasp it in the way that I have to say, others in government wanted to. So I'm going to pay fulsome tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for North East Bedfordshire, who, if I can put it in this way, absolutely got it. My right honourable friend, the member for Guildford, who, after the Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull asked her question last week of the Prime Minister, we were sitting here next to each other. I won't repeat everything that we said, but we basically said to each other, for goodness sakes, words to that effect, let's just get on and get this done properly. Not just a public inquiry, but most importantly, I would say, the money. And as I say, I'll come on to that. And I also want to pay tribute to Jane Ellison, who was also a previous Minister for Public Health, and I know that Jane got this as well. But it took the extra material that has been forthcoming in recent times to be able to be put forward to the government as further evidence as to why there should be a public inquiry. Because in all these matters, no matter really how much ministers and obviously honourable and right honourable members on both sides of the House care about something, see why something should be done, it needs political will. So I pay handsome tribute to the Prime Minister for not messing about this, and I know she will have been supported with wise words from my right honourable friend, the Minister, and indeed from the Secretary of State, who I know will have made the case to the Prime Minister. But she's not messed about, she's grabbed it by the horns, she's done the right thing, she's taken the right decision, and we're now having the public inquiry. But I would go further and say this to the government. There is this second grave injustice, and I was reminded in some of the correspondence which I've had with some parents in my constituency. Their son was 9, he was a haemophiliac. If that isn't bad enough, the parents of a haemophiliac, when he was 9, he was diagnosed with both AIDS and Hep C. And notwithstanding that triple combination, the real challenges in his life. As often he has been blighted by plain prejudice. I mean, horrible stories of bullying at school because of that triple condition that he had. Now he is married, he's the father of a child, he owns his own home. Their complaint is, and these are such wonderful, good people, I mean, they give you every heart about the goodness of people who have often suffered, not just injustice, but I mean real concerns, and to see their son suffering and him as well. They bear no grievance against anybody, but they just want a proper financial package. Now, we've heard from the Honourable Member for Central Ayrshire and Glasgow Central, and I think it was the Honourable Member for Central Ayrshire who talked about this ex gratia payments, and they're not compensation. Could I beg the government, because I remember these schemes, I was horrified to hear from the Honourable Member for Stratford-upon-Avon that these schemes have not been sorted out. Scrap them, get rid of them, and in blunt, simple terms, give these people the money they deserve and need. Don't give it as ex gratia payments. Don't have them having to scrabble together bits of paper to go cap in hand asking for money, as if they haven't suffered enough. How demeaning that they have to go, as they see it, begging for bits of money. I would urge the government to do this. Get a load of money. These things are possible. We know it can be done. Get the money that is required, and all you then need to do, and I know it's not quite as simple as that, is not look at liability, look at quantum, as we lawyers call it. How much does each individual, or the widow of somebody, or whoever has survived those that have already passed away, how much money would they be entitled to if liability wasn't an issue and it was all about how much? And now do the right thing. I do believe the government can find the money. I know many in government, including the former Prime Minister David Cameron, who absolutely got this, but for whatever reasons, it wasn't the right time in government to do this. But he got the human side of all of this, as many of us have done, and now sort out that second grave injustice, which is the money. Get the money together, put it in a pot, decide quantum, and give these people everything that they absolutely deserve and they need. And then finally, the last grave injustice, national scandal, actually will have been sorted out and solved, and of that we can all be proud.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like my honourable friend for Kingston upon Hull North, I first became engaged in this issue after 2010 when constituents contacted me, one constituent in particular, a remarkable man called Andrew March, who I'll say a little bit about in a moment. I feel slightly ashamed that I didn't fully understand the utter tragedy of contaminated blood, because it's not been with us for 7 years. It's been with us for more than 30 years. And I think we have to, as a country, own up to the fact that we don't do these things very well. The same is true of Hillsborough. The same in many ways is true of Grenfell, that these are not matters which have happened and then been dealt with appropriately. They're things which we have failed to address over years, if not decades. And I would just say one or two things on the remit and the type of inquiry, because these are multiple failings. Yes, there are, of course, there is the failing which led to the infections and the multiple infections in the first place. And I have to say, until recently, the government would not even mention the word negligence. Now I'm pleased to say, due in large part to what the gentleman Andy Burnham has done, we are now talking about criminality. But it's taken a long time to get there. The way that the victims have been treated by the establishment, again, one could make comparisons with Hillsborough over many, many years, the way that they have been ignored and badly treated, and including in relation to recompense and financing, the fact that the various trusts and schemes, the quantum involved, but also the administration of it, has just been appalling. And I have said to Minister after Minister over the last 7 years. What is needed is a bespoke solution. We're talking about a finite and decreasing number of people here, a bespoke solution for each of these individuals and families, because everybody is in a different position according to their circumstances, their health and their own personal needs. And finally, in relation to the way that they have had to fight, yes, we have paid tribute to, and I do again, to my honourable friend for Kingston upon Hull North and many other members. I'm surprised that the all-party group doesn't have 650 members rather than 111. But the real credit goes to the victims themselves, who've had to fight and fight and fight to get really very little, and the frustration that I've felt taking part in every debate on this subject over the last 7 years, and through the endless meetings with ministers through the all-party group. I'm glad that the Minister has said that his mind is open in relation to the type of inquiry, because we do need an inquiry that has powers, such as the 2005 Act inquiry, that has powers to call witnesses, interrogate them under oath. I do think we need the forensic skills which a judge will bring to that, but at the same time, that inquiry needs to have credibility and it needs to have trust. And we do not want to start making the same mistakes we've made in the sex abuse inquiries and are beginning to make, I'm afraid, in the Grenfell inquiry as well. And I was listening on the radio the other day to Dr. Richard Stone, who assisted the Macpherson inquiry because he was someone trusted in that case by the local community. And I think what we need here is a combination of those forensic skills and people who know the issues, know the people involved and are trusted by them. We have to have full access to documentation. We have to have proper rights of audience for the victims and their families, and we have to have full representation, and that does mean legal aid. And I hope in the same way that the government is now discovering its neglect of social housing over many years has been a mistake, they will discover that the cuts in legal aid that have been made are also a mistake and are false economies. And I say that while paying tribute to what the Minister said today, but remembering that in the last debate, which Andy Burnham held in this House, which is only some 2 months ago, we were told that a public inquiry was not appropriate. Not appropriate, Madam Deputy Speaker, when just some of the issues that have been dealt with here, non-consensual testing, victims not being informed of the results of those testing, non-consensual research involving previously untested patients, the way that if people were informed, they were informed in hospital corridors, through the post, minors being told without their parents being present, all of this happening in our country within the relatively recent past. And then the cover-up, the allegations in relation to documents being destroyed and people not being prepared to even answer questions. All of that does have to be addressed through this inquiry. Given the time, can I just end by going back and talking about Andrew March, because a large part of my involvement in investigation is solely down to him, and I'm going to, with his consent, and these are personal details which he courageously wants to be in the public realm, because he wants us to get to the bottom of this. He wrote in a letter to me earlier today. He said, I've been looking at my medical notes and discovered that essentially I am one of the patients who was not informed by their hospital, in my case Coventry and Warwick Hospital, that I had non-A, non-B hepatitis throughout the 1980s. And similarly, I was not informed I had hepatitis C when the hospital tested me without myself or my parents knowing. He was a minor at the time. Despite testing me years earlier without myself or my parents knowing. I only found out by accident in October 1992 when I transferred my care to the Royal Free in London. And he quotes from the consultant's letters at the Royal Free where she says, on further discussion, he, that's Mr March, did not seem to be aware he was hepatitis C antibody positive, and we therefore spent some considerable time discussing our understanding of hepatitis C infection and the implications of antibody positivity. Andrew says, I am a severe haemophiliac and one of only 250 HIV-positive haemophiliacs who remain alive today. Of those originally infected in the 1980s, more than 3/4 have died during the course of the past 3 decades, many of them my friends. I was also infected with hepatitis B and C, and despite treatment, I continue to live with the adverse effects of cirrhosis of the liver. I am also one of 3,872 haemophiliacs and persons with bleeding disorders who've been notified as being considered at risk of VCJD, the human form of mad cow disease. This tragedy, this avoidable tragedy, has completely transformed Andrew's life. It has put him in a huge disadvantage. He has never been properly received proper explanation. He has never been properly recompensed for that. And despite that, he has devoted his life to ensuring justice for all the victims. We owe it to him and all those other victims, many of them now unfortunately already dead, to drill down forensically into this tragedy, to do so in a way which leaves nothing unexposed, but to do so within a reasonably speedy time. Because if we do not do that, then there is a reducing number of people who will get justice.
Yeah. Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and welcome to your seat. It's the first time I've spoken since you've been in the chair. And I'm pleased to follow my honourable member from Hammersmith and the very almost unreal case that he mentions that few of us can hardly really believe is true if we haven't lived through it ourselves. And I'd like to start really by paying tribute to all of the campaigners up and down the country who have worked so hard to get this on the agenda, in particular the honourable member from Kingston upon Hull, but also so many members from right across the House. And I think it really does show how pulling together, this is how Parliament should work. And it's taken a long time, but we can make a difference. And I hope it really will make a difference to those victims who have suffered. And with today's announcement in particular, I hope that will really change people's lives once this public inquiry gets going. And I'd very much like to thank the Prime Minister and the Government for listening and for responding over this very tragic affair. And I just wanted to talk about when I first became the MP for Taunton Deane, one of the first people that came to see me, who doesn't want to be named, came to my surgery and he did tell me the desperate story of how his whole life had been blighted by being treated inadvertently with infected blood, like so many other examples that we've heard of today. And I was quite naive and I'd never actually engaged with anybody like this before, and I was deeply shocked by the whole experience that he's gone through the whole of his life. And of course, having been given the infected blood, it then plagued the whole of his life, which became blighted. But it wasn't just that. It wasn't just the fact that he was ill. It also affected his whole quality of life. And one of the things that resonated the most with me was the fact that it affected his whole relationship with his son. He said he just couldn't have the time to spend with him. And then one thing that we all take for granted, I think, as parents, is that we like to leave our children something, some sort of inheritance, or some money, even if it's not very much, for a car or a share of a house or a bit of financial help. And he was really distraught because he felt he hadn't done justice to his son because he wasn't able to, because he'd been so ill. He had a problem holding down continuous jobs. And so not only was he suffering from the blight of the illness, he has also carried this guilt with him for the whole of his life. But practically, there were also two main concerns that he raised with me about the system where we have tried to help. One was that he felt the level of financial support was not sufficient to enable him to feel secure, and he was constantly struggling. And two, the scheme that administered his payment, the McFarlane Trust, which has been referred to by colleagues today, was not working effectively and consequently was not adequately supporting those that it was designed to help. I have spoken on this issue a number of times in this chamber and in Westminster Hall, as well as privately to the Department of Health. And I was very pleased to hear the Government had listened to voices, and that this autumn a new single scheme I absolutely welcome, with the additional funding of the £125 million, Minister, and that's being made available, and it's going to replace that complicated system of the 5 support schemes. And of course the devil will be in the detail, but I know that this Government will be taking into consideration all the comments from the consultation, and hopefully this will iron out some of these problems so many people have been struggling with, and will make life better for the victims. But I'm particularly pleased as well with the moves that this Government has taken over the whole issue of transparency, and that has also been much referred to today in this chamber. And I do appreciate that there are some very serious concerns about how this has been handled in the past. But from now on in, I know that ministers are very keen to make sure that they will make all information readily available, and that this has been promised in the inquiry announced today.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Of course I would give way.
I'm very grateful. I'm very grateful for my honourable friend giving way, because I too have a constituent who was infected by contaminated blood since the 1960s, and he will be delighted that this public inquiry is coming forward, because he wants to know why it's happened and he wants to know how he can get access to proper compensation. And I think that transparency is absolutely vital in this case.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I couldn't agree more. Really, transparency must and should be absolutely the nub of this inquiry. And I know that that's very important for my constituency, but it's important for my constituent, but it's important to all those up and down the country who have had their lives changed forever through no fault of their own. That's what we must remember. It's nothing they brought upon themselves. And so to wind up, I really do want to thank the government for listening and giving this attention, giving this issue the attention that it really deserves. Also for more than doubling the department's annual spend in this area, and let's make that funding simple, and let's really make it get to the people that really need it. And more importantly, I thank the government for announcing this inquiry, and I'll be able to go back to my constituent that I mentioned at the beginning of my speech, and I'll be able to give him a further glimmer of hope. A, that the Prime Minister has understood all this and called the inquiry, and B, that we're going to get the inquiry right. Public inquiries are rare events. We need to make sure this works. New evidence will be emerging, and that will be made available, and I urge that all relevant and commercially sensitive documents are made available, and with the right framework, progress can be done. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope that the right thing will be done at last, and I urge the Minister for this inquiry, above all, not to drag on for too long, because for those who have suffered too long already, time, unfortunately, is of the essence.
Jessica Morden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I wanted to speak today in this debate on behalf of my constituents, Lynn Ashcroft and the Smith family, who will come on from Newport, who will come on to later, who were both victims of the contaminated blood scandal. But can I start very quickly by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Oxford East, for an excellent maiden speech. And she quite rightly highlighted the importance of this campaign and her local campaigners in her maiden speech. And I think that's very important, and we look forward to many more speeches. And while I'm at it, can I also add to the tributes to my honourable friend, the member for Kingston, Hull North. We have this debate here today because of her. She has worked absolutely tirelessly with honourable members, and indeed it's a parliamentary life well spent on this issue, if not for all the other things I know she's campaigned on. But she's done it for the victims, and in welcoming the announcement of the public inquiry today by the government, I agree very much with my honourable friend that it's so important that the families are at the heart of this. This has been a long, long time coming. We've failed this community many, many times, and they need to be at the heart of it and to have confidence in this public inquiry. Because it is absolutely shameful, really, that 45 years since the first people were infected with HIV and hepatitis from NHS-supplied contaminated blood and blood projects, and yet still we've not got to the truth of the community affected, who've been let down so often, but still come here relentlessly to lobby, to come and see ministers, to lobby MPs, all these years later to fight for justice. And I pay tribute to them for their strength. And I'm very struck. I remember a family telling me not so long ago that in the end they had to stop going to the funerals of the friends that they'd made as part of this campaign because it just got too heartbreaking. There were just too many funerals to go to, and I think that's really sad. And as the honourable member for Lee said in his last speech in this place, there's plenty of new evidence which backs up what campaigners have known and felt really in their bones for many years, that risks of contaminated blood were known by the authorities and pharmaceutical companies at the time and were still used, and that people were used for testing and as guinea pigs, and that efforts were made to suppress that truth. And let's remember, these were people who went to the NHS for treatment and were infected by blood provided by the NHS, provided by the state, and they've had to fight for years for this to be acknowledged. No fault's ever been admitted by either the government or the pharmaceutical companies who supplied the contaminated projects, and it was said that was because no one could have known at the time about the problem with this blood. So through the work of the campaigners, honourable members and the media, we now have this new evidence that risks were known, which is why the inquiry must start now so we can get to the truth once and for all. As the honourable member for Hull North said, over 2,400 people have died, thousands more had their lives wrecked by it. I just want to talk about one, Colin Smith from Newport, from my constituency, who was one of the youngest victims of the contaminated blood scandal, and illustrates just why this inquiry can't come quickly enough. Collins went into hospital in 1983, 8 months of age, for a minor ear condition, and as a haemophiliac he received factor VIII, which the family learnt following a Freedom of Information request from a batch from a prison in Arkansas. He spent his short life fighting illness. He died aged 7 of AIDS and hepatitis C in 1990. The family didn't even know he had hepatitis C until 3 years after his death. This was kept secret as so much was hidden. And I hope this is looked at in the inquiry, because people like Hayden Lewis, who my honourable friend, the member for Cardiff Central, mentioned earlier, had to battle and battle to find this information out. Colin died aged 7 in his mum's arms, weighing just about the same as a baby. And I've told Colin's story before in this chamber. It's a heartbreaking story, but because telling these stories is such an important reminder of why we're here today. It's also an important reason for having the public inquiry, because we now know, as Colin's family knew in their hearts, I think, for many years, but have since outlined in Panorama, in Private Eye, that recently unearthed letters from Colin's haemophilia specialist in 1983 recorded that following his minor incident, and I quote from the letter, without any evidence of intracranial bleeding, the child was still given factor VIII. The specialist added that all these materials carry the risk of hepatitis, but this is something haemophiliacs have to accept. He said he would keep Colin under close observation as months go by. 6 years later, after Colin had died, the same specialist wrote to the pharmaceutical company saying he could no longer supply more samples because Colin was no longer at his facility. Colin's family were never aware of this until much later on. This and other evidence needs to be brought before the public inquiry, so witnesses can be called under oath and all documents can be disclosed. Because this and other evidence points to the risks of using this blood supplied by profit-making American companies, and this being known in 1980 or earlier, and that's 3 years before Colin was given this blood. As Colin's tribute on the Tainted Blood website says, thousands of people like Colin didn't make it this far. He never had the chance to join the Cubs, play football for his school, have a girlfriend, go travelling or get married. Instead, his short life was filled with hospitals, doctors and illness. He was just a little boy, but a very special one who we at Tainted Blood always keep in mind as we campaign. He's in my mind because every day when in my constituency at home, I drive past the Smith's house often with my 8-year-old son sat in the car next to me, and I imagine how I would feel if this had happened to me. So I just say to the Minister, you know, would I have been happy there was a public apology? Would I have been happy for the kind of limited financial support which people felt they had to beg for? Or would I want to finally get to the truth? Now, nothing can bring back Colin and others, but we can at least have a public inquiry that gets this right, and we need to get it right this time, because Colin's family, other families have been through so much over the years that we can't let them down again.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's interesting to follow the member for Newport East and hear the reflections she's just brought and again the personal stories. And for me, that's what brought me to this issue 2 years ago when I was first elected, and someone comes into my office, heavily disabled, who should actually have been someone who's fit, healthy, relatively young, not that much older than myself, but instead has had their whole life dominated by a series of treatments they received back in the 1980s. And the point I always make with this isn't the issue about someone having a couple of opportunities taken away, or perhaps lost a couple of quid, or having to work a little bit longer to be able to finally retire. This is about people who literally had their whole lives that were going reasonably taken away, all opportunities removed, and for many, and as I touched on, the 2,500 people, literally the end of their life caused by a treatment programme that should have helped cure them. And I did agree with the member for Central Ayrshire that doctors wouldn't be able to, in an operating theatre or in a hospital, look at every single thing they were doing. They have to rely on those agencies that vet things as safe and certify things as safe. And clearly in this instance there was a huge failure. Therefore, I'm pleased to actually see the progress there's been over the last couple of years. And I did remark when I first spoke on this that I suspect my predecessor, when he got elected in 1997, wouldn't have expected his successor in 2015 to still be talking about this issue. And therefore, it's very welcome that we're finally going to have a public inquiry to look at exactly what went wrong. I was reassured to hear many of the comments from the Minister about how there will be genuine consultation around the terms of reference, and those are going to be very important. Certainly, if there is evidence of criminal wrongdoing, then I'm very clear that nothing done in an inquiry should prevent those people potentially being held to account for any criminal liability in a court of law. It would be such a pity if the inquiry that finally brought about justice and finally brought about answers was then the one that prevented people being held to account in a criminal setting. I certainly was reassured to hear the Minister's reference towards the Hillsborough inquiries, and obviously there are charges now which I won't go into that have followed from that. And obviously, hopefully, in this instance, that the same pattern can be established if there is evidence there. And I think we'd all join with all the calls already being made that anyone with evidence should hand it over to the police immediately, and certainly shouldn't be withholding anything that would be of interest to them in terms of identifying whether people need to be held to account in that way. I think it is right that there's proper consultation on what form the inquiry takes. Certainly, I do think it will be a need to have some form of ability to compel people to take part and to provide some evidence. I was reassured to hear the Minister is considering those issues quite carefully, because that could make quite a difference, particularly if there is knowledge that there's potential criminal sanctions available, that if people can just take the option not to take part, that may have a real impact in getting to the truth of what has happened. And particularly in terms of getting to those answers, it is appropriate that there is some form of limit in time. I think we can all think of examples of public inquiries that have taken very long periods of time, that have seemed to drag out forever. And I think, as has already been touched on, whilst people have had to wait decades for this to happen, there is a limit to how much longer many of those victims will actually be able to wait for the final answers to what happened to them. And also, actually, in many cases, for children or families of those who've already passed on who want to find out what happened before they pass on themselves. Very briefly, given time.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for allowing me to intervene. The member will be well aware of the fact that the Prime Minister recently announced, very wisely, that the government was going to introduce an independent public advocate for public disasters. Wouldn't it be wholly appropriate for the bereaved families and the victims in this very sensitive and difficult case, right across the country, right across the UK, to have this independent public advocate appointed in time to represent them?
I thank the member for her intervention. She makes a powerful point, and I'm sure the Minister sat on the bench will have heard it and will be wishing to consider those points as part of the consultation that will be forthcoming around how the inquiry is structured and how victims are represented. I can imagine, given what their experience has been over the last 30 years, they may have strong views around whether it's a state-appointed person, whether it's someone themselves, and I think it's important that how they're represented is determined in consultation with them, than perhaps necessarily on the floor of this House, and I'm sure all representations will be considered very carefully to ensure they can be appropriately represented. But certainly in my own constituency, there's been 3 ladies who've constantly raised this matter with me, Jean Hill, Michelle Digby and Margaret Murray, who have been determined in pursuit of this matter and determined in wanting to find out answers and to reach justice. I know actually even while I've been in the House since the Minister's statement, Margaret has been in touch to question when the compensation payments are going to be made, given the forms for this were sent out over 12 months ago. And again, looking at how we can bring all the issues to resolution, as well as finding the answers about what happened 30 or so years ago, will be so important in this matter. But no, for me, Madam Deputy Speaker, I welcome the statement we've had today. I congratulate the member for Kingston upon Hull North for her pursuit of this and securing this debate, and also the right honourable member for Worthing West, who's been diligent in pursuing the victim's case. And I hope that finally we can get the answers that those who've suffered from this for too long deserve and actually have an absolute right to receive.
David Hanson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's the first chance I've had to speak under your chairmanship, so congratulations to you. I also congratulate my honourable friend for Oxford East on her maiden speech. It was a very powerful intervention on behalf of her constituents, and I wish her well in her parliamentary career, which I hope will be at least as long as the former member Andrew Smith, who served this House for over 30 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, it would also be appropriate that I do also pay tribute, as have many honourable members, to my honourable friend for Kingston upon Hull North. On behalf of all of the members who've supported her in the all-party group, of which she said there's over 111 members from all sides of the House, to raise the issue and to look at the real effects of the causes of this scandal, but also the recompense and the support given to those people who have suffered as a result. And it's on both of those two issues that I wish, if I may, in the short time I've got, just to comment today, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are two clear issues that we need to address. One is the history of why this has happened, what caused it and what could have been done to prevent it, and indeed, as has been said, who is liable and who is responsible. But there's also the issue of what the state does to those who have no blame in this matter, and what support and type of support is given to those people who are now currently facing some of the challenges that are as a result of the scandal that we're discussing here today. Now, I don't expect, again, the Minister to be able to answer all of these questions today, because it is clear that the efforts of both my honourable friend for Kingston upon Hull North and other honourable members, and indeed the letter that has been sent by 6 party leaders, has focused the government's mind on how to respond to this issue today. And I accept and understand that, but I think it's important that we do put some challenges to the Minister about the form of the inquiry in due course. The Welsh Government in Cardiff called for an inquiry publicly in January, and I know that they would be interested also in having the support of the House here today for that response. I raise these issues because, like all honourable members who've talked today, I have constituents who have had the impact of the contaminated blood scandal go through their lives over the past 30 years. They wish to remain anonymous, and that's quite right that they do so. But in meeting them, I have known and seen the impact on their lives. Not just the trauma of seeing people who were infected at the same time, who have since died in large numbers, but also the fact, as has been mentioned, that people cannot get insurance, cannot maintain potentially sometimes stable employment, have the problems of not knowing if and when they're going to live and how long they're going to live, and what is going to happen to their relatives in the case of my constituents who have young children who may face the consequences of their early deaths at any time.
The gentleman's making a very powerful case, and he actually came on to exactly the point that I was going to make. There's a lot of people who have not been catered for to date, but who were badly affected, such as my constituents whose father got infected, died, and they ended up in a children's home, had their lives totally devastated, and are not within this whole process, and they should be.
I think the honourable gentleman for Huntingdon makes a very good point. My constituents that have approached me are still alive, and they're concerned about what happens to their children in the event of their death. They're concerned about lack of insurance, about the cost to their lives as a whole. In one case, Madam Deputy Speaker, they're concerned, and it's been mentioned already, that the records that they have been lost by the state about the time of their infection and about the difficulties that they may or may not be able to hold liable for because the records have simply disappeared. Those are real challenges, and I hope that the inquiry looks at those in detail. I think it also, and I'm pleased again with the Minister, that it is a UK-wide inquiry. These matters happened before devolution, but I have constituents who represent and live in the constituency I represent in Wales who were infected in Liverpool, which is now in the Department of Health's jurisdiction. I have constituents who are affected in Wales who live in Wales. I've also had correspondence with people who were infected in Wales but now live in other constituencies. So I think it's important that we look at that as a whole, and I'd be interested in the Minister's ultimate discussion on the terms of reference about how he's going to involve devolved administrations. He's given some indication today, but also what the terms of reference are going to be, and how that consultation will take place, and what opportunities there are to input into that. Because I know that my constituents will want to make sure that we get to who's responsible, why it happened, what could have been done, and ultimately whether there's any compensation or redress needed now to help meet the very real challenges, such as that mentioned by the Honourable Member for Huntingdon in his speech. Given that we've got a Hillsborough-style inquiry, I think it's really important, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Minister in due course, not today, but in due course, sets out clearly not just the terms of reference, but also the terms of engagement. Because I very much share, and was going to make the point myself that the Honourable Lady for North Down has just mentioned now, that to be frank, the people I represent want to try and get on with their lives. They've had something happen to them when they were very young that they had no control over, that they were victims of. But it doesn't engulf their whole life. They want to try and get on with their lives as a whole. And I think it would be very helpful if the government would set out how it believes that the victims can engage with the public inquiry in due course. Not just in terms of the organisations such as the Haemophilia Society and others, but also individuals who maybe are not involved in any organisation, and how they will be able to get representation, support themselves financially if that's required for representation, perhaps have the independent advocate that has been mentioned by the Honourable Lady for North Down, and be able to put their case effectively to the inquiry.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, pleased to speak on this occasion with you and the Chair as well. Very briefly, picking up on that point there, constituent of mine called Michael from Runcorn wants justice, but he wants justice that involves all the families, engages them and helps shape this Hillsborough-style inquiry. So certainly welcome the public inquiry that the Minister has announced and the Prime Minister, but you know, impatient for justice shaped by them.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for Weaver Vale for his intervention. I think the point that I want to finish on, if I may, unless the Minister wishes to intervene, I'll certainly give way.
Just briefly, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd just like to remind the Honourable Gentleman for Dunne, I think he's making some very important points, that it is our intent to contact all of the families who are in touch with us through the different schemes, to alert them to today's announcement so that they will have an opportunity to contribute to our determination of the best form of inquiry, and then to pick up his second point about how, once the inquiry is established, should people be able to engage with it. I think that will be down to the inquiry itself to determine how it engages with people, and they will obviously be interested in any advice they're given by members of this House or others.
Well, I'm grateful to the Minister, Madam Deputy Speaker, for that intervention, because it does help reassure me on behalf of my constituents about the process. I simply say to the Minister, I think that in making the announcement today that he has, the key thing for the future is confidence and transparency, and to ensure that people can feel that they can have their say, that they can feel that the points they wish to put are put properly and effectively, and that there is essentially, Madam Deputy Speaker, some timescale so that they know how long of their lives this is going to take. And if the Minister can do those things, and perhaps again inform the House of any budget that he's setting for the inquiry, the staffing for the inquiry, the things that we would expect in any inquiry that's been taking place, that will help reassure people that the government is not just responding to events and pressures from my honourable friend, but is actually keen on getting a positive outcome for the people who are innocent victims of what is a national scandal. And I hope the Minister can both keep the House informed, but also particularly keep those who've been affected informed, because at the end of the day it is their lives, their future, and the uncertainties they've had demand the compassionate, considered support I'm sure the Minister will give them.
Order. We are going to, I don't want to impose a formal time limit, but I would ask members to try to keep to 4 minutes, and in that way I won't have to impose a formal time limit. Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome you to your place. I join other members in paying tribute to all of those affected by this terrible tragedy, the families of those affected, and to honourable friends and members in this House, including the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North and the Honourable Member for Worthing West and my honourable friend for Stratford-upon-Avon. And I pay tribute actually to the Honourable new Member for Oxford East for delivering her maiden speech in this important debate. Madam Deputy Speaker, I am speaking today because I want to give a voice to my constituent, who members will understand wishes to remain anonymous. He was born with haemophilia. He had to endure this terrible chronic condition, and the treatment for that condition has in fact poisoned him, because he has been infected with both HIV and with hepatitis C. And those infusions have condemned him to a life of pain, of serious medication which have themselves their own side effects, of major surgery and of worry. Worry seems a very inadequate word to describe the constant weight that must be on his mind and the minds of those who love him each and every day of his life, because this episode, this tragedy, has affected every single day of his life, and it has affected his life in every single aspect of it, from his marriage to his ability to work to his family. He told me recently that he and his wife have told their grown-up child of his condition and of his infections, because, as he said to me, when is the right time to tell your child that you have HIV and hepatitis C? And so my constituent welcomes today's announcement. He asks, please, for a Hillsborough-style inquiry because, as has been said before, he says people affected by this do not have time on their side. And here, Madam Deputy Speaker, I must declare an interest because I speak as a barrister. I very, very much hope that this public inquiry will ensure that public money is directed towards those who need it most, namely the victims and their families, not on massively expensive tribunal costs. And I put that warning out there to any former colleagues of mine in the legal profession. But finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious of the wish of other colleagues to speak in this debate. I'd like to talk about a school photograph that my constituent brought in to a surgery. It was a photograph like any other school photograph, children smiling, teachers on either end of the row, but this photograph was different because it showed my constituent's class at his specialist school that he had to go to because of his medical condition. 8 of his fellow pupils, of his school friends, had haemophilia. 4 of those 8 are now dead as a result of contaminated blood infections, and another one is so ill that in his early 50s he is forced to live in a specialist care home because of the way in which his body has been left. My constituent, like the thousands of others that we have heard about today, are the victims of a terrible episode in our national life. They have fought for justice for 30 years, and I would like to thank this Prime Minister and this government for listening and for acting. And I very much hope that this inquiry delivers answers for them.
Peter Heaton-Jones.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is, too, the first time I've had the pleasure of speaking in this House with you in the Chair. Can I welcome you to your position and echo what has been said in thanking the Honourable Lady for being able to secure this really important debate. And also, while I'm here, it was a pleasure also to be in the chamber for the maiden speech by the new member for Oxford East. I congratulate her on taking her seat. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not going to take up too much of the time in this House, in this debate, but what I wanted to do was to draw the House's attention to a constituent of mine. It is a case that I've raised in this place before. I've been fortunate to be called in debate to speak on this issue on a number of different occasions. And my constituent, Sue Threckle, is somebody who has been communicating with me now for more than 2 years. She was
As one of my other colleagues was saying, she was one of the first people to come to me after my election in 2015 to raise this issue, and it was one of the first cases that I decided to take up and to follow. And as other colleagues have said, I have to feel a sense of shame that I was not personally aware of the background to this story before I started to hear some of the personal testimony. Now, what I'm intending to do merely is to read part of an email which Sue Threckle sent to me yesterday when it became clear that this emergency debate was going to happen. I've been in quite constant touch with her. And she asked me briefly to share with the House her story, because it says, in more powerful words, I think, than anyone else could, why it is so important that we have this full public inquiry. At the time, of course, we were not aware of the government's announcement, which I warmly welcome, and I pay tribute to not only my honourable friend, the Minister for Health, but the Prime Minister also for driving this forward. But let me share with you what Sue Threckle wrote to me in her email yesterday. My husband, Bob, died in 1991, aged 47. Despite being a severe haemophiliac, he had lived a relatively normal life until he was given commercial blood products. Following that, his health and his life followed a deep and dark downhill path. He contracted hepatitis B, C and HIV. He died a terrible death, which I believe was wholly avoidable. He was never informed about the risks known at the time of imported factor VIII. He was never told he had hepatitis C, and indeed I only found out myself a few years ago. His HIV test result was withheld from us for many months, thus leaving me at risk. I was fortunate, but many other women were not. From autumn of 1990 until 2 days before he died, a few months later, with shadowing on his lungs and despite being at high risk of contracting pneumonia, he was left untreated. He never had the chance to see his eldest son married, nor to meet his grandchildren. He didn't see his middle son graduate from university. He didn't see his youngest son pass the 11+ and go to grammar school. Following his death, our family basically fell apart. Grief sent us in different directions, and for many years we were completely broken. The fallout is still there today, bubbling away just below the surface. It is my firm opinion, Sue Threckle writes in conclusion, following campaigning and research since 1985, that haemophiliacs were used as guinea pigs. I believe that had people acted differently at the time, Bob and so many others would almost certainly be alive and well today. Now, I found my constituent Sue Threckle's email extremely moving, and I repeat her words to the House today because I think it says better than almost any of the rest of us could why the decision that's been taken by the government to hold this public inquiry is so welcome. I will be following very carefully this process as it goes through to ensure that the form of the inquiry is the best that it can be, so that victims and survivors like my constituent can get the truth and the fairness and the justice that they deserve.
Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I first would like to start by echoing what's been said by so many in paying tribute to the victims of this tragedy, their families and those many honourable members who have campaigned tirelessly for such a long time to ensure that this public inquiry takes place, and also to our Prime Minister who, after so many people have listened to these concerns and has organised this full public inquiry. As a doctor, I prescribe blood products, and that will be continuing every day, often for people who are not in a position to make decisions themselves. In my case, I've prescribed blood for babies that have been born very prematurely, children who have cancer, people who are not in a position to make these decisions, in the same way as has been the case for many of the youngsters with haemophilia and other constituents that have been described today. This is an issue of trust, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is important that when people go into hospital and they receive treatment, that they're able to trust that the risk and benefit, this decision that is being made with them, or if they're very small or unwell on their behalf, is done on the basis of all the facts that are known, all the information that is available. In this case, it appears that that was not the case. People knew that HIV, hepatitis and hepatitis B were transmissible through blood products. and yet despite that, that information was not being made aware to those people who were receiving them, and that the bloods were not being properly screened, and even at a time, as I understand it, at a time when blood was being screened elsewhere, products were being used on people in the UK.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yes.
I want to thank my honourable friend for giving way, because trust is the key word there. Trust and faith, if you're to have that in the inquiry. And my constituent, every story is different, is a twin, Barry Flynn. His other twin isn't here. And on behalf of him, he wants to have trust in the inquiry. He wants the victims to be heard. He wants them deciding the remit, and also to ensure that evidence is taken from them. Does she agree that that is the way to get trust?
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you for that intervention. Absolutely, I do. The victims and their families have the right. They deserve to know what happened. They deserve answers to the questions that they need. They need to know, when did people know that these blood products could be causing them harm, and if they did know, why were they still given? And one should be, the House should be under no illusion, as I'm sure after listening to many eloquent members describe their constituents' cases, of the suffering that these people have gone through, losing their family members, the stigma which still exists today of many of these medical conditions, particularly HIV, the risks that other people have been put through, such as their wives, their children, and the suffering that many still go through today with their poor health. I very much welcome the public inquiry, and I hope it will get to the bottom of all the answers, and I hope that those who have been victims receive the compensation that they deserve.
Tom Pursglove.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I also join in welcoming you to your new role. I'm absolutely delighted, and I'd also like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Oxford East on what was a brilliant maiden speech, and finally just pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull Null for being such a doughty champion of this issue here in Parliament. And I think that this debate today has been conducted in a way that we can all recognise as being hugely positive. It's been very, very constructive, and I think that's what people would expect. People out there in the country would expect us to carry out this debate in a responsible manner, because this very much affects people's lives. And I'm acutely aware of that, because one of my constituents who's been caught up in this tragedy is a lady called Sue Wathen, who is a local teacher. Her husband is a counsellor. They are friends. They are people who I care very much about. And I was shocked, rather like a number of my other colleagues were, when shortly after I was elected, Sue and Peter asked me to go round to their house, and they told me all about the things that they had gone through and the difficulties that Sue was facing in trying to access the Harvoni treatment that she so desperately needed. And so I know that Sue will be sat at home watching this debate this afternoon and will welcome this announcement no end, because things have gone so disastrously wrong in the past. We do need to get to the bottom of that. And I think what was a particular shock to Sue was that after 30 years she was diagnosed as having this condition. It was a bombshell. She was sat marking books in her office at school when the telephone call came to tell her that she'd got this condition. And I think what is most welcome about this announcement today is the fact that there is this firm commitment to ensure that the victims of this tragedy are properly listened to, that they have a real involvement in shaping the inquiry. And I think that there are lessons that can be learnt from what has happened in relation to Hillsborough. And it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that the Prime Minister is so committed to addressing this issue. We've seen her take up a number of injustices. Hillsborough is one of those examples, and I hope that we can get to the bottom of what has happened in this particular tragedy. And the victims know how it affects them on a day-to-day basis. It knows the consequences on their families, and they should be listened to, and they should help to shape the inquiry. And one key point that I suspect will come up in all of these discussions in the weeks and months ahead is this issue of access to treatment. And unfortunately, from time to time, NHS bureaucracy does get in the way of accessing the treatments. In Sue's case, we went through an absolute multitude of dramas in getting the Harvoni treatment that she so desperately needed. But in the end, we were successful. I'm very grateful to ministers in particular for all of their efforts in helping to go about achieving that. And one thing that I always remember Sue saying to me when we first had that early conversation was she said, "I'm not worried about compensation, I just want to get better." And I think that there's a lot in all of that. These are all issues that the public inquiry needs to consider, should address. I welcome this very much, and I look forward to the debates ahead.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and like others, I welcome you to your position in the Chamber today. But I would also like to put on record my thanks to the Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull North for bringing forward this debate today. And in the short time that I've been a member of this place, I've been struck by her determination and her perseverance in bringing forward this campaign. An issue that quite clearly, Madam Deputy Speaker, cuts right across both sides of this chamber. And I would just like to add my thanks also and recognition to all those members who are not in the chamber today, those who perhaps have moved on following the election, who have also played a part in this campaign. And of course, David Cameron, who at his last PMQs said he wanted more to be done on this very important issue. But this is an important matter that, to many of us here in the House and outside of the House. And as we've heard today, so many constituents have been affected and are still affected today. And it's an issue that was brought to my attention first about a year ago when a constituent came to my surgery. But the issue that she raised was one slightly different. We've heard a lot about stories of victims and those who are suffering as a result of the contaminated blood tragedy. But this lady came to raise the issue of support for the spouses of those who have died from contaminated blood. And she had a number of questions and concerns, particularly around the discretionary payment fund. She in particular wanted to know exactly what her position would be, and she felt as though she was in limbo regarding her monthly payments. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a tragedy, and it means so much to so many people, as we have heard, and people who, through no fault of their own, suddenly have found themselves in hardship and really suffering as a result of what has happened. And as we know, this tragedy goes back to the 1970s to the 1980s. It's an issue that has spanned several governments. It's a long-running issue. But for those families, the family in my constituency and those across the country, that other members here have raised today, it is still a priority for them, and rightly so. And I sense today, from what we've heard from the Minister and from the Prime Minister in her statement, that it's still a priority for the government as well. And we should continue to be providing support for those affected by this tragedy. I'm very conscious of time, Madam Deputy Speaker, so I'll draw my comments to a close just by saying that I hope this inquiry does bring together all parties, including the families and the victims, because after all this time has lapsed, there are still families wanting answers and a sense of conclusion and closure to this tragic issue.
Simon Hall.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I too welcome you to your place. I have a confession or an apology to make, I suppose. When I was first briefed on this issue, I have to say I put it in the too difficult to deal with category. Maybe it was too niche. It was too much of the past. It lacked a contemporary feel to it. I was wrong, and the Honourable Lady for Hull North has proved the point today, and she is to be congratulated. Because I've been reflecting, listening to this debate, that so many of our constituents view this place through that very narrow prism of 30 minutes or so on a Wednesday. This has shown Parliament at its best. Cross-party and interest in an issue coming together to try to find a solution. And I welcome the words of the Honourable Lady for Hull North in relation to my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. As a number have pointed out, lots of ministers have listened, just as lots of ministers listened to the tragedy of Hillsborough. But my right honourable friend seems to have something of her essence, where she doesn't just listen, but she decides to act in a fair, calm, sensible way, but always in the pursuit of justice for our constituents and our fellow citizens. And this issue, Madam Deputy Speaker, speaks to a time long past, a different time, for procedures, practices and medical processes. It certainly predates patient rights and predates, as a number of honourable members have mentioned, our devolution settlement, which will doubtless throw up some challenges for the inquiry as it moves forward. But it is a contemporary issue in terms of pain, suffering and anxiety that so many colleagues across the House have referenced. I strongly welcome the Government's decision to move towards a single payment scheme, to have 5 silos in which to try to apply and to justify their needs in case, as my honourable friend, the member for Stratford-upon-Avon, alluded, added indignity upon injustice. Now, money isn't everything, as I think a number of colleagues have raised the point. Yes, the travesty of the ill health unnecessarily and probably avoidably placed upon sufferers from contaminated blood are going to mean that not just their medical costs are greater, but their social and their lifestyle costs are greater as well. But the inquiry seems to me absolutely the crucial point. Now, I must confess, I am sanguine on a personal level as to whether this is a panel or a judge-led inquiry. If it were to be, or were it to be the latter, and I agree with the Minister entirely, this has to be done in concert with those who have survived to identify the best way. I do hope that we will be able to rally around the authenticity of the judge, if a judge is to be appointed, and not question their motivations or their bona fides. Time is not on the sufferer's side, and we must move forward quickly to this. This is a campaign which has festered for too long. I conclude by once again congratulating the Honourable Lady, and I hope that those who are suffering, who are bereaved, who are in pain and who are anxious today are in some way sustained and comforted by a brighter glimmer of the hope of justice at the end of that tunnel.
Bob Seeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Government very much for this announcement. I'm new to this issue, so I pay tribute to the honourable members who have done much work over the previous years, the Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull North, as well as the member for West Worthing, Stratford-upon-Avon, and others who have had the wisdom to champion this cause when it was not fashionable. I think islanders affected will, I believe, now have a sense of relief that all the truth around this scandal will come out, and I suspect some of it may be very difficult listening indeed. I didn't actually know if I should be speaking, but I decided to do so after listening to the very moving experiences of some of my residents. They have asked me to be here and to listen in to the debate, and I'm glad that I've done so, and I thank them for that suggestion. I've had residents, as we all have, who've lived with this now for some decades, including several who contaminated illnesses linked to corrupted blood as young as 9 years old. One resident, Janet Shepherdson from Freshwater in the west of my constituency, worries not only for herself but for other members of her family. And she told me that her life has been turned upside down by the contaminated blood case. She said, "My infection has caused me to suffer from a disabling and debilitating autoimmune disease. You may be as amazed as I am to know that despite all this, I was refused funding for the new generation direct-acting antiviral treatment for hepatitis C by NHS England, and I was obliged to buy it myself earlier this year." So not only do I have residents who have been suffering, but they do feel that the NHS, which let them down in the first place, along with others, has not provided the support now that it should have done so, and this concerns me. Madam Deputy Speaker, the light of investigation, whether by government, media or interested parties, is critical to making progress in our society, to uphold justice and to lessen suffering. Often those inquiries are difficult, as we've seen from Hillsborough, we may well see from Grenfell Tower and others, because it asks questions for those in authority, it tests the system. The outcome should be justice, and as one of my right honourable colleagues or my honourable colleagues just said, and trust, both in the system but for people here to do the right thing and to battle for their constituents. But in summing up very briefly, I think islanders will want to know a series of questions now. Now, I know that some have been asked, and I won't repeat them all, but I think 2 or 3 outstanding ones that I would like to stress. is if the Minister or Government could at some point explain the difference between a statutory and a Hillsborough-like inquiry, especially for those of my constituents who are interested in participating in this inquiry, how the widows and families of those who are already died, 2,400 of them, how they will be treated as participants, but also how will their claims and how their financial and other claims be treated. And finally, I think, again, the reassurance, well, two things. Firstly, the potential criminal elements have to be investigated to their ultimate conclusion, but also can he reassure us that as being as comprehensive as possible, it will be time limited. Thank you.
Ella Fernandez.
Speaker, and I welcome you to your place today. I thank the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull North for calling this debate and for her indefatigable campaigning on this subject. I congratulate the new member for Oxford East on an excellent maiden speech, and I'm confident that that's the beginning of many excellent contributions to this chamber. There are many colleagues on both sides of the House who have been tireless in their advocacy for the victims of this unspeakable tragedy for many years. I'm a relative newcomer to this issue, and I speak on behalf today of my constituent, Jackie Britton, who lives in Portchester. And Jackie has met with me on several occasions, for she too has not given up on this fight. Jackie contracted hepatitis C in 1982 from a blood transfusion during childbirth. She was only diagnosed in 2011, and for many years she has been afflicted with a debilitating illness and has been suffering for many years. Her daughter too has been very ill with various medical conditions. And I'm sure that Jackie would welcome the news today about a public inquiry into this matter. It's clear that the government is seriously reflecting the concerns and the voices of those who have been tragically affected by this incident. And this is the latest in action that has been taken on the part of this government over several years. This government has increased the amount of money spent on payments to victims to record levels since 2016, with an additional £125 million in support funding for those who need it. I'm also pleased that this government last year announced that they were going to reform the package of support measures for those affected. For the first time, almost 2,500 beneficiaries with chronic hepatitis C were eligible to receive an annual payment of £3,500 per year. That's progress, and I think that that is a result of listening and action on the part of the government. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will conclude my comments because I'm aware of other colleagues wanting to contribute. There is really nothing that anybody can do to change the past on this awful incident and tragedy. But I do hope, for Jackie's sake and for the sake of all of those victims about whom we've heard today, that today's inquiry and the process of discovering the truth, of bringing some justice to those affected, will provide some solace and finality on this heartbreaking tragedy.
Jonathan Dunne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Welcome to your place, and thank you for squeezing me in at the end of this debate. And for the many reasons explained in many excellent speeches from honourable members on all sides today, I've been really impressed and very pleased with the government that they have thought this through afresh, which is significant given the previous inquiries and many debates on this issue. And the apology given by the Minister today, I thought, was an important step which will be appreciated by the victims. I note what the Minister says on the need to consult on the form of the inquiry, and given the numerous positions on this issue alone, I think he makes the right decision to engage with the affected groups. And I do hope, though, that an element of urgency will now be forced into this process in order to move things forward, so that we can think always about the victims and how they have been waiting so long. Can I just say that I hope the inquiry will look into the decision to acquire these products in the first place, And who was responsible? That is the period before anyone in the UK became infected. This is a tragic story from start to finish. I acknowledge the persistence and total commitment of my affected constituents and those involved in the wider campaign to seek the truth. It is due to them that we're here today, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady for Kingston upon Hull for leading APPG and for calling this debate. We must acknowledge here that there are variations in the interpretation of the facts and history of this scandal. In the case of one of my constituents, Tony Ferrugia, he feels that evidence from his injected father's medical notes, infected father's medical notes, namely a letter, had been removed from his father's medical records. The letter was noted in the 1991 HIV litigation, but has been removed since. When my constituent received the notes, the letter was missing, and his later attempts to retrieve the letter from the Department of Health have failed. The letter states that his father was given a bad batch of F8 in 1980 and reported on the 7th of June 1983. But surprisingly, his father wasn't told until February 1985, nearly 2 years later. Looking at this, I don't know the answers to these questions, and I don't believe my constituent knows all the answers. But it seems to me, from discussions with my constituents and from the limited documentation that I've seen, that there are a series of horrific mistakes here, leading to a series of unimaginable consequences that make it really important that we do get to the truth of what happened. Efforts to deal with this issue to date, and there have been a number we need to recognise, simply have not satisfied the people concerned, or many of them at least. The point is that many people affected by this tragedy, especially children and wider family members, have not been offered compensation, and in any event don't feel that there will ever be closure until full facts are known and that they are included in the process. I do appreciate that the government feel that there has been proper disclosure of the information that they have, but the fact remains that there is a clear disconnect here between the various parties on this issue, and as ever with these types of events, it's not just what happens between the various parties and where you can see fault, but also the lack of flow of information afterwards, which not only can make the original situation worse, but is immensely frustrating for the victims' families. As has been explained to me by my constituents Tony Ferrugia and Chris Smith, who are members of the Fatherless Generation Action Group, this is a scandal of frankly epic proportions, and I look forward to seeing continued progress on it.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's delightful to see you in your new place in the Chamber this afternoon. Can I also start by congratulating the Honourable Lady for Oxford for her maiden speech. I think that was an excellent start, and I'm sure she's going to have a very long career in the House of Commons. Today we've heard some really important and excellent contributions in this debate, and I think we all were very moved by the contribution by my honourable friend for Newport East when she talked about Colin Smith, a little boy who received contaminated blood products when he was quite tiny and died eventually of AIDS and hepatitis C. And that reminded us all, I think, that this is about boys and girls, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters that have been affected by this scandal.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I will very briefly.
Right, thank my honourable friend. Does she agree with me that these blood products should have been withdrawn as soon as the risks about their use became clear?
I think that's a very good point, and hopefully that's one that the inquiry will be able to get to grips with. I'm really pleased that we've had this announcement today from the government, but I would gently say to the Minister that we will not be going away on this. We will be following very carefully, parliamentarians from all sides of this House, how the consultation is taking place and who's consulted, making sure that there's a good timetable, a timely timetable, that there's legal support for those people who need help with representation, that there are regular updates to this Parliament. And I just wanted to finish with a quote from a person who's just emailed me, and they've said that this is just the end of the beginning and still a long way to go before truth, justice and holding to account are achieved. But we will be watching very carefully now what the government do next.
Hear, hear.
Order, order. The clerk will now... because we finished early. OK, the question is that this House has considered the need for an independent public inquiry into the contaminated blood scandal. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.